Gideon Rusk didn't knock. He kicked the door open so hard the frame cracked, and the sound of it, that's splintering wood, that deliberate violence was the only announcement he needed. Miriam Holloway spun around from the stove with a cast-iron ladle still in her hand, and her children scattered like startled birds, the little ones pressing against the wall, and the older ones going still, with the particular stillness of children who had learned that movement sometimes made things worse. Rusk walked to the center of the room, looked around at the 8 faces staring at him, and smiled. "You got 3 days," he said. "After that, we start removing things. Starting with the children. If this kind of story moves you, stories about ordinary people who refuse to be broken, subscribe to this channel right now and follow every part of Miriam's journey to the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The summer of 1887 arrived in Wyoming territory like a punishment. The grass turned the color of old bone by June. Creek beds cracked open and went dry. Cattle drifted toward fence lines, looking for water that wasn't there, and the few ranchers who still had wells guarded them with a quiet desperation that didn't need to be spoken out loud. The sky stayed white from morning to evening, a bleached, merciless white that pressed down on everything and made the distances look longer than they were. Miriam Holloway had been driving through that sky for 11 days. The wagon was older than it looked, which was already old enough that 2 of the wheel spokes had been replaced with green wood that hadn't seasoned properly and flexed in a way that made Miriam's jaw tighten every time she heard it. She'd repacked the load 4 times to redistribute the weight. She'd rationed the water twice over. She'd told herself and her children each morning that today would be the day the road improved. And each evening she'd looked at the same flat, sun-baked emptiness and understood that she had been wrong again. 9 children. The oldest was 14-year-old Aaron, who sat in the back of the wagon now, with his arms around his 2 youngest siblings and a look on his face that was too old for his age and had been there since the morning they buried his father. Then came Nora, 13, who almost never cried but had taken to humming to herself in a low, tuneless way that Miriam recognized as a child trying to hold herself together with sound. Will, 12, was the practical one, the one who had taken over checking the wagon wheels and coiling the harness leather each evening with the focused, mechanical competence of someone who needed to be useful to survive. Clara, 10, had assumed responsibility for the younger ones without being asked, keeping track of who needed water, who needed to relieve themselves, who was beginning to overheat. Thomas, 8, Elsie, 7, Levi, 6. Then Caleb, who was 4 years old and had spent the last 2 days with his head against Miriam's hip, quieter than 4-year-olds were supposed to be. His skin carrying a warmth that Miriam had been monitoring with the practiced dread of a woman who had lost children before and could not afford to lose another. And June, barely 10 months old, bundled against Miriam's chest in a length of cotton fabric tied twice around her back. So still now that Miriam kept pressing her palm against the baby's ribs to feel her breathe. They had left their homestead with more: a cow, 2 pigs, a second horse, most of their furniture and half their tools. All of it was gonzan now, sold or traded at each stop along the way, each transaction necessary, and each one carrying the particular grief of watching the solid evidence of your former life disappear one piece at a time. The homestead itself was gone before any of that. Silas Crowder's men had come in February, 3 months after Daniel Holloway was killed, and Miriam still used that word, killed, because there was no other honest word for what had happened to a man who had been in perfect health at breakfast and was found in a ditch before supper with marks on him that no fall from a horse had ever made. The men had arrived with documents that looked official. They had titles, registration records, territorial filings. They had a lawyer present, which gave the whole proceeding an air of inevitability, as if the paperwork itself were a natural disaster that could not be argued with. Miriam had argued with it anyway. She had gone to the county clerk with her own deed, the one Daniel had filed when they first settled the land 9 years earlier. The clerk had looked at her deed, then at Crowder's documents, and told her with the careful neutrality of a man who knew which way his bread was buttered, that there appeared to be conflicting records, and that it would need to be resolved through proper legal channels. The proper legal channels, it turned out, had already been resolved, just not in her favor. She'd had 2 weeks to vacate. She'd packed what she could, loaded her children, and started driving east, because east was where she'd heard there were settlements, communities, places where a family might find temporary work, or at least temporary shelter, while a widow with 9 children figured out what came next. She had not figured out what came next. The first town, Carver's Crossing, had looked at her wagon full of children and offered her one night in a boarding house, on the condition that she leave the older boys outside. She declined and kept driving. The second settlement had a minister who suggested, gently and with what he clearly believed was genuine compassion, that the children might be better served by placement in separate households, perhaps some of them in an orphan home in Cheyenne. Just temporarily, of course, until she could establish herself properly. She'd declined that too, in terms that were not gentle, and that the minister had apparently not expected from a widow woman. 3 more stops. 3 more versions of the same conversation. Too many children. Too much responsibility. Too little certainty that she would be able to pay. She understood the mathematics of it from their perspective, even while something in her chest went cold and sharp each time another door effectively closed. They gave her what they could, sometimes a meal, a night's sleep, a bag of cornmeal. They were not bad people, mostly. They were just people with their own margins, their own limited surpluses, their own calculations about how much risk they could absorb. She stopped explaining herself after the 4th town. The map she'd found among Daniel's things showed a settlement 30 miles further east called Grover's Station. The map was 8 years old, but she didn't have a better option, and 30 miles felt manageable even with the wagon in its current condition. She'd been wrong about that too. The left rear axle started grinding on the morning of the second day out from the last settlement, making a sound like something being slowly torn apart at a molecular level. She'd stopped and looked at it, Will crouching beside her, both of them understanding what they were seeing. "We can make it," Will said. He was 12 and needed to believe this. "We can try," Miriam said, because she was 36 and had learned the difference. They made it another 4 miles before the wheel gave. It didn't collapse catastrophically, which would have been almost better, something definitive to respond to. Instead, it settled at an angle that made the wagon impossible to drive and possible to repair, only if she had the specific hardware she didn't have, and a way to get it she didn't have either. She stood on the road for 2 minutes, just stood there. The children were quiet, which was how she knew they understood the severity. Even Caleb had stopped asking when they would get there. Then she started organizing. She took inventory of the water, which was worse than she'd thought. The main barrel had a slow seep she hadn't noticed, and they were down to perhaps half of what she'd calculated. Caleb's forehead was warmer when she pressed her hand to it than it had been at dawn, which meant the fever she'd been watching was moving in the wrong direction. June was nursing, which was the only reason the baby was quiet when Miriam had nothing left to give her. June's silence would become something else. "Aaron," she said, "take Thomas and start walking toward the east. Look for any kind of structure, a house, a barn, a shed, anything. Come back and tell me what you find. Don't go more than 2 miles. "What if I find something?" Aaron asked. "Come back and tell me," she repeated. "Don't try to handle anything yourself." She watched him go, then turned to the remaining children with a face she had specifically composed to communicate that this was a problem to be solved rather than a catastrophe to be survived. Even though she was not entirely certain of the distinction herself. She was sitting on the wheel hub with Caleb in her lap, and June nursing under her shawl, her back against the broken wagon, when she heard the horse. She looked up. The man riding toward her was alone. He sat his horse the way ranchers sat horses naturally, without thinking about it, as if the horse were simply an extension of wherever he decided to be. He was somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s, broad through the shoulders, wearing a hat that had been through considerable weather. He slowed when he was still 100 yards out, which she noticed and appreciated a man who understood that a woman alone on a broken road with children didn't need to be approached at speed. He stopped 10 feet away and looked at the wagon, at the children sitting in it and around it, at Caleb in her lap and the bundle against her chest, at Miriam herself. "Axel," he said. "Axel," she confirmed. He dismounted and crouched beside the wheel without being invited, spending maybe 30 seconds examining it. When he stood back up, his face was neutral in the way of a man who has just confirmed something he already suspected. "I've got a place 3 miles east," he said. I can ride back and bring a proper wagon. Take you all in while we sort out the repairs." Miriam looked at him carefully. Why? The question came out more direct than she'd intended, but she didn't apologize for it. She'd learned the cost of not asking direct questions. He looked back at her with equal directness. "Because you're on the road with 9 children and a broken wheel, and it's 100 degrees. I count 8, Elsie said from the wagon. Small voice, precise correction. The man looked at the bundle against Miriam's chest. 9, he said. Elsie seemed satisfied with this. Miriam studied him for another moment, the way he'd counted, the way he'd answered her question without performing offense at being questioned, the way he'd crouched beside the wheel before offering anything, checking what the actual problem was rather than assuming. "What's your name?" she asked. "Thatcher Boone, Miriam Holloway." She paused. "I have to tell you something before you go to that trouble." "All right. Every town from here to the Nebraska border has told me no. Too many children. I want you to know that before you ride back and bring a wagon and then decide we're too much to deal with. I would rather you tell me that now." Thatcher Boone looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the children in the wagon, at Clara holding Thomas's hand, at Nora watching him with wary eyes, at Levi and Will and Elsie, at Caleb with his too warm face. "I heard you," he said. "I'll be back in an hour." He rode east. Miriam sat back down on the wheel hub with Caleb. She told herself not to believe it. She was good at not believing things she'd learned, that at Carver's Crossing, and refined it at every stop since. Hope was something you rationed, same as water. You didn't spend it until you knew what you were spending it on. But she watched the direction he'd ridden until the road curved and he disappeared. Aaron came back 40 minutes later, breathless, with Thomas 3 steps behind him. "There's nothing, Mama," Aaron said. "Road goes over a rise, and then there's just more road. I think the settlement on the map might not be there anymore." Miriam had already considered this possibility. "Sit down and drink some water," she said. Carefully. He did, watching her face for information. She gave him none, because she didn't have any to give. 53 minutes after Thatcher Boone rode east, a wagon came back around the same curve Aaron had disappeared around. Thatcher was driving it, and there was a boy of maybe 16 in the back ranch hand, she guessed, someone he'd grabbed on his way through. He pulled up beside her broken wagon and got down without ceremony. "Let's get your things transferred," he said. Miriam stood. "Mr. Boone, I need you to understand our situation before we go any further. I have no money. I have some tools and supplies, but no cash. I don't know yet what I'll be able to offer in exchange for your help." Thatcher stopped what he was doing and looked at her with the expression of a man who has heard something that requires a response but is choosing his words. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I'm not keeping a ledger on this. Let's get your children someplace with water and shade, and we can talk about the rest later." "I need to know what the rest means to you," Miriam said. "I have 9 children. I need to know what you expect." He looked at her steadily. There was no irritation in it, no impatience. Just a man being looked at carefully by someone who needed to see him clearly and understanding that this was reasonable. "I expect you to get in the wagon," he said. "That's all I expect right now." Miriam Holloway, who had not cried once in 11 days of driving through the Wyoming heat with 9 children and a broken axle, and a baby who was too quiet and a 4-year-old with a rising fever and no prospects, felt something shift behind her sternum that she immediately suppressed. "All right," she said. "Children, start transferring what we can carry." The ranch hand, whose name turned out to be Pete, 17, gap-toothed, and good with children in the awkward, careful way of a young man who wasn't used to them, helped load the supplies. Thatcher picked up Caleb without asking and held him on the wagon seat beside him, the way you held a child who needed to be held, easy and without making a production of it. And Caleb, who had been fussy and resistant all day, went still against his arm and seemed to exhale something. Miriam watched this from the side of the road where she was gathering the last of their things. She told herself it didn't mean anything. Men were capable of brief kindness. That was not the same as reliability. She picked up the last bundle and climbed into the wagon. The Boone Ranch was 3 miles east, through a gate that read Boone in iron letters that had weathered to a particular shade of rust, and then down a long track that opened into a yard with a house on one side and a barn on the other and a well between them with an honest-to-goodness pump handle. The children were quiet for the first few seconds, taking it in. Then Levi said very quietly, "It has a pump. I see it," Clara told him. "A real pump." "Levi, I'm just saying it has a pump." The house itself was bigger than Miriam expected. Solid log construction, 2 stories, a covered porch running the full length of the front, deep-set windows that someone had built with intention. It had the look of a house built for permanence, built with the assumption of a future, and then not quite lived up to. The porch boards needed work. The window frames could use paint. The yard was functional but not tended. It was the house of a man who had maintained the structure and let the details go. Thatcher pulled the wagon to a stop beside the well. "Water first," he said. "Then I'll show you where you can sleep." He helped Caleb down, then moved to assist the other children, efficient and matter-of-fact about it, not performing generosity, but simply performing the task of getting children out of a wagon. Pete disappeared into the barn with the horses. Miriam climbed down herself. There was a woman standing on the porch, older, 70s, with the particular economy of movement that comes from a lifetime of practical work. She watched the children descend from the wagon with an expression that was somewhere between assessment and something Miriam wasn't quite ready to name. "This is Agnes," Thatcher said. "She comes twice a week to help with cooking and cleaning." "Agnes, this is Miriam Holloway and her children." "How many?" Agnes said. 9, Thatcher said. Agnes looked at the children. She looked at Miriam. She looked at the bundle against Miriam's chest that was beginning to make sounds indicating it was ready to nurse again. "I'll put the soup pot on," she said, and went back inside. Miriam stood in the yard of a stranger's ranch with her 9 children and tried to calculate what was happening, what it would cost, what would be required of her, what risks she was accepting. She was very good at calculation. She had been calculating since February. She couldn't make it work. The arithmetic of a man who simply brought a wagon back and helped lift children out of it, and held a sick 4-year-old on the seat beside him, and said he wasn't keeping a ledger, that arithmetic didn't resolve into anything she knew how to be afraid of yet, which frightened her in a different way entirely. Caleb tugged at Thatcher's sleeve. "Is there water?" he asked, small and serious. "Right there," Thatcher said, pointing at the pump. "Can you work a pump handle?" "I'm 4, so that's a no. Come on." He took Caleb's hand, just took it, the way an adult takes a child's hand when there's something to walk to, and led him to the well and worked the pump until water came out clear and cold. Miriam watched her sick 4-year-old drink clean water from the hands of a man who had not asked for anything in return, and felt something she did not have a name for settle somewhere deep in her chest like a stone dropping into still water. She told herself it didn't mean anything. She was not sure she believed herself. Agnes fed them. Not just adequately, she fed them. Beef stew with actual vegetables in it, cornbread, a pot of coffee for Miriam, and warm milk for the smaller children that Elsie drank, with a solemnity that made Pete choke on his own dinner, trying not to laugh. Agnes moved around the table with no particular warmth, but with complete competence, refilling without being asked, redirecting Levi's elbow before he spilled anything, cutting Caleb's bread into pieces without comment. The children were quiet in the specific way of children who are trying to behave perfectly because they understand the stakes. After dinner, Thatcher showed them the rooms. The house had 4 bedrooms upstairs. He'd prepared 2 of them clean sheets, he said, without explaining how he'd managed that in the hour he'd been gone, which meant he'd had Pete changing sheets before the wagon had even finished loading, which Miriam filed away without comment. The boys in one room, the girls in the other, Miriam and June in a narrow room off the kitchen that had presumably been used for storage and had been cleared enough to fit a cot. "I'm down the hall," Thatcher said at the top of the stairs. "If you need anything in the night, knock. I sleep light." "We won't need anything," Miriam said. He looked at Caleb, who was being carried by Aaron because he'd gone boneless with exhaustion and fever. "You might," Thatcher said, and went back downstairs. Miriam settled the children, which took longer than it should have, because the beds were real, and the children had been sleeping in or under a wagon for 11 days, and the reality of horizontal softness seemed to require processing. She nursed June until the baby finally let go and slept, then sat in the near dark of the kitchen room and listened to the house. It was quiet in a way the wagon hadn't been. No wind sounds through canvas, no creak of wheel, no distant coyote. Just the house's own sounds, the settling of wood, the distant sound of the barn, And once, from downstairs, the sound of a man setting a lamp down on a table and then silence. She thought about Gideon Rusk. Rusk had been at her door in February 3 days before Crowder's lawyer arrived with the paperwork. She hadn't understood who he was. Then he'd presented himself as a surveyor, asked to look at the property lines, thanked her politely and left. It wasn't until later, when she was going over everything in her memory, looking for signs she'd missed, that she'd placed him at the edge of the field on the afternoon Daniel was killed. Not close enough to be responsible for anything that could be proven. Just there, watching. She'd included that in her account when she'd gone to the sheriff. The sheriff had listened, nodded, and explained that proximity wasn't evidence. She knew Rusk's name because one of the hands on a neighboring property had recognized him and told her, quietly and without wanting to be identified, that Gideon Rusk was Crowder's man, had been for years, was the kind of man Crowder sent when he needed something made to happen or made to stop. She knew his name, his face, and the fact that he had watched her husband die. That was all she had. She checked Caleb's forehead before she tried to sleep. Still warm. Not worse than it had been, she thought, or maybe not much worse. She wetted a cloth from the pitcher on the washstand and laid it across his forehead and sat with him until his breathing deepened and evened out. She was back in her own cot, June warm against her side, when she heard Thatcher's boots on the stairs, not approaching her door going to Caleb's room. A pause. Then quiet again. She lay in the dark for a long time after that. She did not sleep until well past midnight. In the morning, Caleb's fever had broken. She found Thatcher already at the stove when she came down with June, and a pot of oatmeal that was not done yet, and a pot of coffee that was, and he handed her the coffee first without turning around. "The child with the fever," he said, still not turning around. "How is he?" "Better," she said. The fever broke in the night. "Good." He stirred the oatmeal. "I'm going to need to ride out to check the east fence line today. Pete will be around. Agnes comes again tomorrow. If you need anything, Pete knows where everything is." Miriam set June on the kitchen table in the way you set a baby on a table when you've run out of hands, supported by a folded blanket, and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Mr. Boone," she said, "yesterday you told me we'd talk about the rest later." He turned around then. "I said that," he agreed. "It's later," Miriam said. He leaned against the counter and looked at her with the same directness she'd seen on the road, that willingness to be looked at without flinching. "I need to know what you want from us," she said. "I don't say that with suspicion. I say it because I have 9 children and I cannot afford to misunderstand a situation." "What would you want it to be?" he asked. "Work," she said without hesitation. "Fair work for fair pay. I'm not asking for charity. None of my children are idle. They all have skills, and they're not too proud to use them. Aaron and Will can work cattle and fence and most ranch labor. Nora and Clara can cook and clean and manage a household. Thomas and Elsie and Levi can do small tasks. I manage supplies, accounts, and animal medicine. Give us wages and a roof, and we'll earn them." Thatcher was quiet for a moment. "I've been running this place alone for 7 years, he said finally. "My wife died. There's no one else. I've managed, but the east pasture's been fallow for 3 years because I can't cover enough ground. The house is." He looked around the kitchen. "It's functional. That's the most I can say for it." Miriam waited. "I wasn't looking for workers," he said. "But I'll take them. Same terms you named, fair wages, roof, no charity. We'll work out the numbers when I get back from the fence line." "That's acceptable," Miriam said. He pushed off the counter. "There's a problem I should tell you about." She felt something tighten. "Red Willow," he said. "The town 3 miles west. The people there they have opinions about things. About what a proper household looks like. About women on their own. About certain situations. When they find out you're here, there will be talk. I want you to know that before it happens." "I've heard talk before," Miriam said. "I know," he put his hat on. "I'm just telling you it'll happen." "Thank you," she said, "for telling me instead of just letting it happen." He nodded once and went out. Miriam turned back to the oatmeal so the children didn't come downstairs to find their mother standing in a stranger's kitchen with an expression she hadn't figured out how to put away yet. The days that followed had a rhythm that surprised her. She had expected chaos, 9 children in a strange place, an unknown man, an unfamiliar routine. What she found instead was that her children were so accustomed to adapting that they adapted immediately, slotting into the structure of the ranch the way water finds its level. Aaron was out with Pete before breakfast on the second morning, checking on the cattle situation with the focused enthusiasm of a boy who had missed having work that mattered. Will took one look at the fence repair situation and started making a list, an actual written list, which he brought to Thatcher that evening with the gravity of a foreman making a report. Thatcher looked at the list for a long moment. "This is thorough," he said. "I noticed the south section has rust on the wire," Will said. "That'll go before the north section does, even though the north section looks worse. The rust is structural." Thatcher looked at the 12-year-old in front of him. "How do you know that?" "My father taught me," Will said. And then, very carefully, with the precision of someone managing something fragile, before he died. A pause. "He was right," Thatcher said. "We'll start with the south section." "Thank you, Will." Will went back inside and did not let anyone see his face for about 5 minutes. Miriam saw it anyway, because she was his mother and she saw everything. She said nothing, which was the right thing to do. Nora and Clara had the kitchen organized in 3 days, not reorganized to their preference, but made functional in ways it hadn't been. Gaps in the pantry inventory noted. Items stored in places that made sense for actual cooking rather than theoretical storage. Agnes arrived on the third day, assessed the changes with an eye that missed nothing, and said only, "Somebody knows what they're doing," which was, Miriam would learn, approximately the highest praise Agnes ever dispensed. Elsie had appointed herself Thatcher's shadow by the second day, following him around the yard with the specific attachment of a 7-year-old who has decided a person is trustworthy and intends to verify this hypothesis through continuous proximity. Thatcher, for his part, seemed to take this entirely in stride, answering her questions with patience and including her in small tasks, with the same matter-of-fact normalcy he brought to everything. On the fourth day, Elsie informed him that he was doing the chicken feeding wrong. "Is that right?" Thatcher said. "You're throwing it all at once," Elsie said. "You have to spread it out, or the big ones eat it all, and the small ones don't get any." Thatcher looked at the chickens. "I've been feeding chickens for 20 years, he said. "And they've been doing it wrong for 20 years, Elsie said. Thatcher looked at Miriam, who was standing nearby and had heard every word and who pressed her lips together and looked at the sky. He spread the feed out. The small chickens ate. "There," Elsie said. "Thank you, Elsie," Thatcher said with a gravity that Miriam had to turn away from before it did something to her face. The town came, as he'd warned. It started with the merchant's wife, a woman named Dora Hatch, who had the particular social precision of someone who has appointed herself the keeper of community standards. She arrived at the ranch on the 5th day with a jar of preserve and a series of questions about the arrangement that were structured as friendly interest, but were actually a data-gathering operation. Miriam answered them honestly and without apology. Widow, 9 children, working arrangement with Mr. Boone, fair wages, temporary while she established herself. Dora Hatch took the information back to Red Willow and improved it on the way. By the time it circulated through town, the arrangement had become something considerably more colorful, a woman who had arrived with too many children and attached herself to a lonely rancher, taking advantage of his good nature, probably angling for something permanent, clearly a poor influence on the respectable families of the territory. Word of this reached Miriam through Agnes, who relayed it with the direct economy of someone who believes people deserve to know what's being said about them. "What should I do about it?" Miriam asked. "Nothing," Agnes said. "That's what most people do about things they can't control. Doesn't stop the talk. What does Mr. Boone say?" "He hasn't heard it yet. He doesn't go to town much." Agnes paused. "He will hear it, and then we'll find out what he says." Miriam thought about this for the rest of the day. She thought about it that evening when Thatcher came in from the fence line and sat down to dinner with 8 children around his table, Caleb in the chair beside him, because Caleb had claimed that chair on the second day and no one had disputed it, and answered Thomas's questions about what cattle ate with the same patience he brought to everything. She thought about whether she should tell him herself before heard it from someone else. She decided, before dinner was over, that she would. She waited until the children were upstairs, June asleep in her cot, the house quiet. She found him on the porch. "Mr. Boone," she said. "There's something you should know." He waited. She told him what Agnes had reported. All of it. The version of her that was circulating through Red Willow, the calculating widow, the woman using a lonely rancher, the arrangement that wasn't what it appeared to be. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Is any of it true?" he asked. "No," she said. He nodded. "All right. That's all you have to say? What would you like me to say, Mrs. Holloway?" She looked at him in the porch light. Most men would be troubled by it. Their reputation. What people think. "I know what I agreed to," Thatcher said. "I know what's happening on this ranch. I don't need Dora Hatch to tell me." Miriam stood on the porch and felt something that was not quite relief, but was in the same neighborhood. "You should also know," she said, "that Silas Crowder was the man who drove us off our homestead, and that Gideon Rusk, his foreman, was present when my husband was killed. In case that becomes relevant, she saw him register this." Something in his face changed. Not much, but enough. "Crowder has holdings east of here," he said. "He has holdings everywhere," Miriam said. "He's been acquiring land throughout the territory for years. The way he acquires it," she stopped. "It's not always legal acquisition." Thatcher looked out at the dark yard. "I've heard of Crowder," he said slowly. "I haven't had dealings with him." "You might," she said. "Now that we're here." He turned to look at her directly. "Is that why you're telling me? To give me a chance to reconsider the arrangement?" "Yes," Miriam said, because honesty was the thing she had decided on. He held her gaze for a long moment. "I don't reconsider arrangements I've made," he said. "Go get some sleep, Mrs. Holloway. The South Fence crew starts at dawn." He went back inside. Miriam stayed on the porch for another few minutes in the dark Wyoming night, listening to the ranch sounds, the cattle, the horses, the distant pull of wind across the grass. She had not expected this. She had not expected any of this. She had been prepared for kindness that dissolved under pressure, for goodwill that had conditions attached to it that would eventually be named, for the particular disappointment of a door that looked open and turned out not to be. She had not been prepared for a man who heard everything she said and then said, "I don't reconsider arrangements I've made." She went inside. She did not sleep easily. 3 days later, the riders came at sunset. She saw them from the garden where she was working with Clara and Nora, 3 horses on the western track moving toward the house, with a deliberate, unhurried pace that communicated intention more clearly than speed would have. She recognized the build of the man in front before she recognized his face, because she had seen that build before, in February at the edge of a field, watching. Her hand stopped moving. "Clara," she said, "take Nora and go inside. Bring the younger children upstairs. Tell Aaron to stay in the kitchen, and tell Will and Pete I need them in the yard." "Mama, go," she said. Her voice came out level, which she was grateful for. Clara went. Miriam stood in the garden and watched Gideon Rusk ride toward her. He pulled his horse up 15 feet away and looked down at her with the face of a man who has all the time in the world and knows it. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Surprised to find you here." "Mr. Rusk," she said. "I imagine you are." He wasn't surprised. She knew he wasn't surprised. He had known exactly where she was. Thatcher came out of the barn, Pete behind him, both of them reading the situation in a single glance. Thatcher walked to the yard without hurrying, stopped beside Miriam, and looked up at Rusk. "This is my property," Thatcher said, "and you weren't invited." Rusk's eyes moved from Miriam to Thatcher and back. He had the particular patience of a man who has done this before and knows how it usually ends. "Mr. Boone," he said, "my employer sends his regards. He's a reasonable man, and he wants you to understand that his concern here is with the woman, not with you. Mrs. Holloway has outstanding matters to resolve. She was asked to leave a property she'd claimed illegally, and instead of complying, he paused. Complicated things for herself. She's working on my ranch," Thatcher said. "Legally, and with my full knowledge, Mr. Boone." "She's working on my ranch," Thatcher said again. "And her children are in my house. And I'm going to need you to tell me what it is you actually want before I decide how I feel about you being on my property." Rusk looked at him for a long moment, assessing, the way a man assesses something when he's deciding whether it's a minor inconvenience or a problem. He made a decision. "My employer is patient," Rusk said. "Mrs. Holloway causes him difficulties. Her presence causes him difficulties. He'd prefer she finds somewhere else to be. He'd prefer that happen." He paused. "Quietly, and if she doesn't," Miriam said. Rusk looked at her. He smiled, and it did not reach anything behind it. Then my employer's patience has limits, like any man's, he said. And the people around her tend to find that inconvenient. Thatcher reached back, without looking, and found the rifle that had been leaning against the barn wall, and brought it to his hands in one movement that was entirely without theater, but was also entirely without hesitation. "You have 3 minutes to get off my land," he said. Rusk looked at the rifle. He looked at Thatcher's face. He was a man who read other men for a living, who understood when something was a performance and when it wasn't. He turned his horse. 3 days, Mrs. Holloway," he said over his shoulder. "My employer is patient for 3 days." They rode back the way they'd come. Miriam stood in the yard until they were out of sight, and then she became aware that her hands were shaking very slightly, which she dealt with by pressing them flat against her sides. "You all right?" Thatcher said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her steadily. "That was Rusk." "Yes, he was at your husband's." "Yes." Thatcher was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said finally. "Not okay as in satisfactory. Okay as in, I understand the situation, and I am not going to do anything about my feelings about it right now, but you should know I have them." "Mr. Boone," Miriam said, "this is going to get worse before it gets better." "Probably," he said. "You should know that. I know it." He set the rifle back against the barn wall. "Go check on your children, Mrs. Holloway. I've got some thinking to do about the east fence." She looked at him for a moment, this man who had come back with a wagon, who had held her sick child on the ride home, who had said, "I don't reconsider arrangements," who had picked up a rifle without hesitation when a threat rode onto his property. "Thank you," she said. She didn't mean it generally. She meant it specifically, for a specific thing she couldn't quite name yet. He nodded once and went back into the barn. From the upstairs window, Miriam could see Elsie watching, small face pressed against the glass. She held up her hand toward the window, a gesture that meant, "It's all right, I'm here. We're staying." Elsie pressed her hand against the glass in return. Miriam went inside to her children. The 3 days Rusk had named came and went without incident, which was worse than if something had happened. Miriam knew this. She'd learned it years ago on the homestead when the first pressure from Crowder's operation had been not threats but silence, the absence of the threats you'd been promised. The waiting that stretched out until you started to wonder whether you'd imagined the danger, whether you were being foolish, whether the sensible thing was to stop watching the horizon and go back to ordinary life. That was the strategy. Make you uncertain. Make you doubt your own judgment. Make the threat feel like something you'd invented because you were anxious and alone. She didn't stop watching the horizon. But she said nothing to Thatcher about it, because he had enough to deal with without her adding to it, and because she was not yet sure what adding to it meant in this particular arrangement. They were employer and employee. He had defined the terms and she had accepted them. That was not the kind of relationship where you brought a man your fears at breakfast. She brought him efficiency instead. Within 2 weeks of their arrival, Boone Ranch ran differently than it had in years, and everyone on the property knew it, and most of them were too polite or too practical to say so out loud. The difference wasn't dramatic. It wasn't that they'd transformed the operation or introduced anything revolutionary. It was simpler than that. It was the difference between one man maintaining a property and a functioning unit of people working it together. Aaron and Will had taken over the East Fence project, working it systematically from the south section the way Will had identified, moving methodically north and cataloging problems as they went. Thatcher rode out with them twice in the first week, checked their work, made corrections, and then mostly left them to it, because the corrections got fewer and the work was good. Pete, who had been running the cattle rotation alone, now had Will as a genuine second, which freed Thatcher to address the water situation in the North Pasture that he'd been managing around for 3 years rather than actually solving. Clara and Nora had the house so organized that Agnes, on her 4th visit, stood in the kitchen doorway and looked around slowly and said, "This is different," and then went straight to the pantry to check whether the order made sense. And when it did, said nothing more about it, which meant she approved. Miriam had taken over the accounts. She'd asked Thatcher for the ledgers on the 3rd day, and he'd produced them without hesitation, a collection of notebooks in serene state of completion that told the story of a man who understood the ranch's finances intuitively, but hadn't been keeping formal records in any consistent way. She'd spent 2 evenings putting them in order, cross-referencing suppliers, identifying where money was being lost to inefficiency versus where it was simply the cost of running a remote operation, and presented Thatcher with a summary on the fifth evening after dinner. He looked at it for a long time. "The feed supplier," he said. "He's been overcharging you for 2 years," Miriam said. "Not dramatically. Small amounts on each order. Enough that you might not catch it if you weren't comparing totals against delivery weights." "How much total?" she told him. He set the ledger down. "That's a significant amount." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "How did you catch it?" "I weighed the last delivery when it came in," she said. 3 pounds short per sack, it adds up." Thatcher looked at her across the table. The lamp was between them, and the evening was cooling down to something bearable. The children were upstairs. She could hear Levi and Thomas arguing about something in the muffled, periodic way of boys who were trying to argue quietly because they knew they weren't supposed to be awake. "I'll speak to the supplier," he said. "You should also get a scale mounted at the loading bay," Miriam said. "So whoever receives deliveries can weigh at the point of arrival." "All right." He looked at the ledger again. "Miriam." It was the first time he'd used her given name. She registered this and didn't let it register on her face. "Yes? Thank you," he said, "for the accounts. I know that's above what we agreed." "You're paying wages," she said. "I'm providing what I have to offer." "Still," he paused, "I want you to know it matters." She nodded and gathered the ledgers and took them back to the shelf where they lived, and told herself that the warmth in his voice when he said it matters was simply the tone of a fair-minded employer, acknowledging good work. She was fairly certain she was right about that. Fairly. Red Willow came at them in 3 waves. The first wave was social. Dora Hatch organized a kind of informal delegation herself, the minister's wife, and 2 women whose husbands were on the town council who arrived at the ranch one Wednesday morning with another jar of preserves and an agenda. They sat in the kitchen with Miriam and drank Agnes's coffee and asked questions that were shaped like friendly interest but had edges. "It must be so difficult," said the minister's wife, a small woman named Ruth Farley, who had a gift for making sympathy sound like accusation. "All these children, and no permanent situation. Have you thought about what your plans are? Long term, I mean." "I think about it daily," Miriam said, "because of course this is Mr. Boone's property, and any arrangement, however generous, is still at his discretion." "I'm aware of that," Miriam said. "We have wages and a working agreement. We're not dependent on his generosity." "Of course not. Of course not." Ruth set down her cup. "We only worry because, well, the children. They're lovely, but there are so many of them. And a man like Thatcher Boone, living alone all these years, one wonders whether he fully understood what he was agreeing to." "You could ask him," Miriam said. A pause. "I beg your pardon?" "Ask him," Miriam said. "He's in the north pasture this morning, but he'll be back by noon. If you're concerned about whether he fully understood the arrangement, ask him directly. He's a plain-spoken man. He'll give you a plain-spoken answer." The delegation left before noon. The second wave was the merchants. Miriam needed supplies, specific items that the ranch didn't stock in sufficient quantity, medical herbs she used for the children and the livestock both, a length of fabric Clara had asked for, that Miriam had promised when they had money, which they now did because wages were wages. She went to Red Willow on a Thursday errand, driving while Miriam sat in the back with Levi, who had come along because he was the most likely to cause trouble if left home and the easiest to manage if kept beside her. The general store owned by a man named Hatch, Dora's husband, which she'd known before she arrived, was the kind of establishment that communicated its discomfort through service. Not refusal, nothing that obvious. Just slowness. Questions about whether she had current credit established. A scrutiny of her money that went beyond normal commerce. A young clerk who couldn't quite look at her directly. She bought everything on her list without comment and left. The hardware supplier was better. The man there, whose name was Beaumont, assessed her list with professional interest, asked 2 practical questions about the fence work to make sure she was getting the right gauge wire, and helped Aaron load everything into the wagon without incident. As they were leaving, he said quietly, "Without making a production of it, Mrs. Holloway, I knew your husband. Briefly. He passed through here about 4 years back buying supplies for the homestead. Good man." Miriam stopped. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out steady, which cost her something. "I've heard the stories going around," Beaumont said. He had the careful manner of a man who wanted to say something difficult and was constructing it precisely. I don't set much store by them, for what it's worth. I appreciate that, she said. Crowder's been operating in this territory a long time, Beaumont said. Very quietly, just for her. He's made a lot of enemies. They're just mostly quiet enemies. Miriam held his gaze. Thank you, Mr. Beaumont. She climbed into the wagon and told Aaron to drive home. The third wave came from a direction she hadn't expected. 3 of the families whose homesteads bordered Boone Ranch to the north, and west the Caulfield family, the Petersons, and a bachelor rancher named Drummond, sent word collectively to Thatcher through Pete that they had concerns about the situation at the ranch and would appreciate a meeting. Thatcher, who did not appreciate organized concerns delivered through intermediaries, rode out to talk to each of them individually instead, which was not what they'd expected and left them slightly off balance in their conversations with him. He came home from those visits in the early evening with the particular silence of a man who has heard things he's processing. Miriam was in the garden when he rode in. She let him unsaddle his horse and put it up before she followed him into the kitchen. How did it go? She asked. Drummond is worried about his property values, Thatcher said, pouring himself water. He believes a ranch with his phrase, a transient, irregular household nearby, affects the perception of the area. And the Caulfields? The Caulfields are more honest about it. They're worried about Crowder. Word has gotten out that Russ came here. They don't want to be adjacent to whatever trouble that brings. That's understandable, Miriam said. Thatcher looked at her. I'm not asking you to leave, Miriam. I know, she said. I'm just saying their concern is understandable. Crowder is a real threat. Proximity to him is genuinely dangerous. They have their own families to protect. He was quiet for a moment. Peterson's different, he said. He said his wife wants to know if you'd be willing to share your animal medicine knowledge. His cattle had a cough last spring that cost him 3 head, and he's worried about it coming back. Miriam blinked. Peterson said that? His wife made him say it, Thatcher admitted. But he said it, she almost smiled. Almost. Tell them yes, she said. I'll ride out Thursday. Thatcher nodded. He set down his cup and looked out the kitchen window at the yard where Thomas and Levi were conducting some kind of investigation involving a bucket of water and a frog that had been found near the well. He watched them for a moment. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. What was your husband like? The question was careful and quiet and held exactly the weight it was supposed to hold, and no more. Not intrusive, not comparative, just genuine. Miriam thought about it honestly before answering. He was good, she said, practical. He didn't talk much, but when he talked, he meant it. He was patient with the children, more patient than I am, sometimes. He built things to last. She paused. He built the homestead to last. He thought it would be ours for a long time. I'm sorry it wasn't. So am I. She was quiet for a moment. He would have liked Aaron. He always wanted Aaron to take over the property eventually. Aaron knew that and felt the weight of it. She glanced at Thatcher. Working with Pete and with you has been, I think it's helped him. To have men to learn from again. Thatcher said nothing for a moment. Then, he's a good worker. Aaron. He sees the big picture, not just the task in front of him. That's not something you can teach. Either you see it or you don't. Miriam held that for a moment, the way you hold something warm without squeezing. Thank you for telling me that, she said. The cutoff of the water happened on a Tuesday. Miriam didn't know about it. Immediately, she was in the barn treating one of the horses for a split hoof when she heard Will shouting from the direction of the north pasture trough. And the tone of the shout was wrong enough that she was moving before she'd consciously registered why. She found Will at the trough with Pete, both of them looking at water that was not clear the way the trough water should be. It was brown, murky, with a chemical smell she identified before she could name, something added, something deliberate. How much of the herd drank from this, she said. Maybe half, Pete said. He looked sick. Before Will caught it. Get them separated, she said. The ones who drank need water from the well, clean water, as much as they'll take. Go. Now. She was already moving toward the fence line, reading the ground around the trough. Thatcher arrived from the east pasture 20 minutes later. She showed him what she'd found the tracks at the fence line, the soft soil disturbed in the specific way of someone who'd come and gone quickly at night. The smell still in the trough. They came in from the northwest, she said. 2 horses, I think. They wouldn't have had to cross into the yard. They could have accessed this trough from just outside the fence. Thatcher's face had gone still. It's not enough to kill them, she said. Whatever they added, it would make them sick, cost you time and productivity, but it's not a killing dose. This is a warning. I know what it is, he said. He stood there looking at the trough for a long moment. She watched the stillness in him, not paralysis, but the specific quality of a man who is deciding something. I want you to check the south trough, he said, and the well casing. Tell me if there's anything wrong. She checked. The well was clean. The south trough was clean. It had been targeted specifically the north trough, the one farthest from the house and closest to the unguarded fence section, the one that served the largest portion of the grazing herd. Deliberate, calculated, expensive to him without being catastrophic enough to justify any legal response. She reported back and watched him take it in. What do you want to do? She said. What I want to do and what I'm going to do are different things, he said. What are you going to do? I'm going to fix the trough, and I'm going to ride the fence line, and I'm going to add wire to the northwest section. He paused. And I'm going to write a letter to the territorial marshal. Will it help? Probably not immediately, but I want it on record. She nodded. I'll ride into Red Willow tomorrow and talk to Beaumont, she said. He said something to me last week about Crowder making enemies. I want to know more about that. Thatcher looked at her. Be careful, he said. I will. He stopped. Started again. Red Willow isn't safe for you right now. If Rusk has men in town, I'll take Aaron, she said. I'm coming with you, he said. She looked at him. You don't need to. I know I don't need to, he said. I'm coming. There was nothing in his voice that was open to discussion. Not possessive, she registered that carefully, the specific quality of the statement. Not I'm coming because you belong to me. Not I'm coming because you're helpless. Something else. Something she didn't have a word for yet. All right, she said. They went to Red Willow together the next morning, Aaron in the back of the wagon with a list of hardware items that gave the trip a legitimate purpose. Thatcher drove. Miriam sat beside him on the seat and was aware of the way the town looked at them as they came down the main street, the fact of them together. The way that read to people who had been generating their own narrative about what was happening at Boone Ranch. She sat straight and didn't look at anyone specifically and didn't apologize with her posture for existing. Beaumont was in his shop. When he saw them come in together, something shifted in his expression, something that was either calculation or relief. She couldn't quite tell. She was direct with him. She told him what had happened to the trough, not as a complaint but as a data point. She told him what Rusk had said. She asked him, plainly, what he knew about Crowder's operation in the territory and who else had been affected. Beaumont was quiet for a long time. Then he said, You understand that I have a business here. I understand that, she said, and that saying anything about Crowder openly could affect that business. I understand that too. He looked at Thatcher Boone. You're a man who's been here a long time. You know what kind of roots Crowder has in this territory. Tell me what you know, Thatcher said. You don't have to say it officially. Just tell us. Beaumont pulled a crate out from under his counter and sat on it, and began to talk in a low, even voice about the pattern he'd seen over 7 years of watching Crowder's operation move through the territory. Homesteads that suddenly lost their records. Families who had valid claims that became invalid through processes that no one could quite explain. A territorial official named Macy, who had gotten considerably wealthier in the years since Crowder began his acquisitions, and who approved filings with a speed that bordered on supernatural. The names of 3 families who had lost land the way Miriam had lost hers. Miriam listened and remembered everything. After, in the wagon on the way back, Macy. The territorial land official. I know who he is, Thatcher said. If there's a pattern of fraudulent filings, if there are other families who could testify. You're thinking about going to someone above Macy, Thatcher said. I'm thinking about finding out who investigates Macy, she said. There has to be someone. Territorial magistrates, federal oversight. That takes time, he said. I know it takes time. She looked at the road ahead. I have 9 children in your house, and a man who told me I have 3 days that turned into 2 weeks of silence and poisoned water troughs. I am aware of the time constraints. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't mean to suggest I know, she said. I know you didn't. She exhaled. I'm sorry, I'm not angry at you. I know that too, he said. They rode for a while without talking, the kind of silence that had started to develop between them. Not uncomfortable, just two people who didn't need to fill space with sound. Miriam, he said. Yes, the fence wire that was cut last week. She turned to look at him. I didn't tell you about that, he said. I found it Thursday morning in the south section. I repaired it before I said anything because I didn't want to. He stopped. I didn't want to worry you before I knew whether it was just wear or deliberate. And? Deliberate. She absorbed this. You should tell me when these things happen, she said. I know. You're not protecting me by not telling me. You're just making me calculate with incomplete information. He nodded. You're right. I'll tell you. She thought about what he'd said, I didn't want to worry you, and the specific quality of that impulse, which was not condescension, but something more complicated. Something she recognized from the way Daniel used to make decisions sometimes. The protective instinct that came from caring more than from believing she was incapable. She didn't say any of this. She filed it away carefully and watched the road. The children had begun to transform the ranch in ways that Thatcher registered daily and didn't fully know how to process. It wasn't the work he'd expected work, and they delivered it, and that was a transaction he understood. It was the other things. The way the kitchen sounded different now. The way dinner had become a specific event rather than fuel intake 9 children into adults, and Pete and Agnes twice a week, food that actually tasted like something, because 4 people had made it with attention. Noise that he'd forgotten was what a house was supposed to sound like. Levi had somehow acquired a dog, not asked for one, just appeared with one. A mud-colored mongrel of uncertain heritage, who had apparently followed him back from the creek one afternoon, and Thatcher had opened his mouth to say something about it, and then closed it again, because the dog was already asleep across Levi's feet, and the boy had his hand on its back, and was looking at Thatcher with eyes that contained a specific hope that Thatcher could not bring himself to extinguish. The dog was called Biscuit, which was either ironic or sincere, depending on which child you asked. Elsie had reorganized his tools. He discovered this on the 3rd week when he went to find his largest wrench and found instead a system tools grouped by type, hung or set in a specific order that made no immediate sense to him, but which Elsie explained was by frequency of use, most used nearest the door, least used at the back. You keep putting things back wrong, she told him. I've had this barn longer than you've been alive, he said. That explains why it was so disorganized, she said. He put the tools back where she'd put them. He was not going to admit to Miriam, ever, that it was actually faster to find things this way. Clara had planted more in the garden in 2 weeks than Thatcher had planted all season, working with the particular focused intensity of a 10-year-old who has decided something needs doing and is doing it. Nora had taken over mending, which meant that things got mended rather than simply accumulating in a basket, and had also identified that the curtains in the main room were letting in light at the edges in a way that was contributing to heat in the afternoons, and had fixed this with a combination of fabric and her own judgment about airflow that actually worked. Thatcher watched all of this and felt something he didn't have a precise word for. The closest he could come was full. The house felt full. Not crowded full, in the way an empty vessel becomes full when you put something real in it. He had built this house for a family. The family had not come, the one he'd built it for. He'd learned to stop expecting it and start simply maintaining the structure, keeping it sound, keeping it functional, without thinking too much about the purpose it had been built to serve. He watched Aaron manage a difficult cattle situation one afternoon with a decisiveness that Thatcher himself would have handled the same way, and felt something that was probably not an appropriate thing to feel about a 14-year-old boy he'd known for 3 weeks, but that he felt anyway. He said nothing about any of this to Miriam. She had enough to carry without adding his interior inventory to the list. The second attack came on a Friday night. 3 sections of fence, not one. The south pasture section that Will had repaired, the northwest section, and a new section on the east boundary that Thatcher hadn't been watching as closely because it was furthest from Crowder's known operation. 22 cattle gone through those sections by morning, driven out deliberately, tracks visible in the dawn light, showing men on horseback pushing them. Not random wandering, organized removal. Will found it first, at first light, and came to the house at a run that brought Miriam out of the kitchen before he'd finished calling. Thatcher was saddled in 12 minutes. Pete in 15. Aaron, who had already been awake for reasons Thatcher didn't question, was ready when the men were ready and fell in without being asked. And Thatcher looked at him once and made a decision and said, "Stay close and do what I say." And Aaron nodded with the serious, steady nod of a boy becoming someone. They found 20 of the cattle in a draw 4 miles east, bunched up against a natural barrier of rock, moved there but not yet moved further. The other 2 were gone, either taken elsewhere or worse, injured in the night drive and down somewhere in the dark. They got the 20 back by mid-morning. The other 2 they found near noon. Not dead. Injured, one with a torn shoulder from a fence wire encounter, one with a leg strain that would heal but would take time. Thatcher treated the shoulder. Miriam had ridden out with the second wagon and treated the leg strain with materials she'd brought, working with the calm efficiency of a woman who has dealt with livestock injury before and understands that calm hands produce better outcomes. She didn't say anything while she worked. Neither did he. When it was done, she washed her hands in the creek water and stood up. "This is escalating," she said. "I know. They're testing what you'll absorb before you respond. Each incident is larger than the last." "I know," he said again. "You've written to the marshal," she said. "Has he responded?" "Not yet." She looked at the injured cattle, then at the fence line, then at the sky, which had gone overcast and close in the particular way that meant weather coming. "I have to tell you something," she said. "Something I should have told you before." He waited. The land records that Crowder destroyed mine weren't the only ones. Beaumont mentioned 3 other families. But I've been thinking about what he said, and there's a 4th he didn't mention directly but implied. She looked at him. "I think there may be records somewhere. Copies." Daniel was careful. He was the kind of man who made copies of important documents and kept them somewhere other than the obvious place. "I wrote to his brother in Nebraska when we were still at the homestead. I don't know if the letter was ever received. I don't know if the brother wrote back and the reply went somewhere I can't access anymore." She paused. "I should have told you this because it's relevant. If there are copies of our original deed, it changes the legal situation." "Where would you have sent letters to?" he said. "The county seat," she said. "General delivery. The address we used before everything fell apart." He was looking at her with an expression she was starting to learn, the one where he was taking in information and processing it, and not reacting before he'd finished processing. "I'll ride to the county seat next week," he said. "Check general delivery for you. You don't have to. The marshal's office is in the county seat," he said. "I'll go anyway to follow up on the letter. I'll check your delivery at the same time." Miriam looked at him. "Why?" she said, not challenging, genuinely asking. The same question she'd asked him on the road the first day. Why? He looked back at her with the same steadiness he'd had then. "Because it needs doing," he said. "And I'm going anyway." She wanted to push further, to ask what she actually wanted to ask, which was something she didn't entirely know how to formulate. "What is this to you? What are we to you? What do you actually want? Because men always want something, and I need to know what it is before I trust it completely." She didn't ask. She picked up her medical kit and walked back to where the wagon was waiting. That evening, dinner was loud. Levi had taught Biscuit to sit, which required a demonstration for everyone at the table, which required biscuit pieces, which Biscuit was entirely in favor of, which required Agnes to issue a formal ruling about dogs at the table. The ruling was that dogs were not at the table, they were beside the table, which was different, and the distinction was maintained with varying success. Caleb fed Biscuit 3 separate biscuit pieces while looking directly at Agnes in a way that tested everyone's commitment to the ruling. Elsie reported that she had found evidence of mice in the Grainsel store and had a plan involving a bucket and a board that she wanted permission to implement. Thomas said the plan was wrong and had a counterplan. This generated significant discussion. Thatcher sat at the head of his table in his house that had been empty for 7 years and ate dinner that tasted like food and listened to 9 children argue about mousetraps and felt the fullness again. That particular weight that was not burden but ballast. He looked at Miriam across the table. She was managing the biscuit situation with one hand and the mousetrap debate with the other, and nursing June intermittently and doing all of it simultaneously with the practiced competence of someone who had been doing many things at once for a very long time. She caught him looking. He didn't look away quickly. He just held it for a moment, honestly, and then moved his gaze back to his plate. She did the same. Neither of them said anything about it. After dinner, after the children were upstairs, and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse and Agnes's second-day work was done, Miriam came to find him on the porch. "I need to ask you something," she said. "All right. Are you afraid of Crowder?" He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. "I respect what he can do," he said. "I'm not afraid in the way you might mean it. I'm not going to change course because of him. That's not the same thing as not being afraid," she said. "No," he agreed, "it isn't." A pause. "Are you afraid of him?" "Every day," she said immediately. No hesitation, no performance of courage. "He killed my husband. He took my home. He has resources I don't have and connections I can't match." "Yes, I'm afraid of him." Thatcher was quiet for a moment. "And yet you're still here," he said, still pushing back. "Where else would I go?" she said. "Running didn't work. Every town told me no. The only difference between Crowder catching up to me here versus somewhere else is that here, she stopped. "Here you're what?" She looked out at the yard. The dark was full and settled. The sky had the stars you only got this far from town, thick and close. Somewhere beyond the barn, Biscuit was conducting some private investigation in the grass. "Here I'm not alone," she said quietly. He said nothing. She hadn't meant to say it. She meant it as a practical statement. She had allies here. She had resources. She had Thatcher and Pete. And now, cautiously, Beaumont and possibly the Petersons. It was a logistical observation. It had not come out sounding purely logistical. She straightened. "Good night, Mr. Boone." "Good night, Miriam," he said. She went inside. He stayed on the porch in the dark for a while, listening to the ranch settle into night, the cattle distant and quiet, the house behind him full of sleeping children. He thought about the letter he needed to write to the territorial marshal, the specific language he needed to use to make clear. This was not a property dispute, but a pattern of criminal harassment. He thought about the county seat trip and what he needed to accomplish there. He thought about the east fence section that needed reinforcement before the weather came. He also thought about Miriam Holloway saying, "Here I'm not alone," and the specific way she'd said it, and the specific way it had landed somewhere in his chest that wasn't related to logistics. He went inside. He did not sleep immediately. 3 days later, Gideon Rusk rode into Red Willow and began having conversations. Miriam heard about it from Clara, who heard about it from the Peterson girl who'd been in town with her mother. Rusk had been in the hardware store, the general store, the saloon. He'd been asking questions, not threatening, not visibly, just asking. What was the story with the widow at Boone Ranch? What did people know about her? Had she said anything about certain documents, certain records, certain legal matters? He was constructing something. Miriam sat with this information in the quiet of the kitchen after the children were asleep and thought about what you built when you went around a town, asking specific questions about a specific woman. You built a picture. You built a case. You built the groundwork for some next move that was being engineered, probably not in Red Willow, but in the county seat. Probably not involving Rusk directly, but involving someone with a legal title and a desk who could make official-looking things happen to a widow who didn't have many resources to fight back with. She thought about Daniel's brother in Nebraska. She thought about the copies. She went upstairs and checked on Caleb, who was sleeping soundly, and June, who made the small breathing sounds of a well-fed baby, and Elsie, who had somehow acquired Biscuit in her bed despite the formal ruling, and Will, who was sleeping with a pencil in his hand because he'd been working on something and fallen asleep mid-thought. She removed the pencil carefully and looked at her 12-year-old son's sleeping face and thought, "I will not let them take any more from you." She went back downstairs and wrote a letter to the territorial magistrate's office in Cheyenne. Not the county seat above the county seat. She'd found the address in an old territorial registry that Thatcher kept in his study. She wrote carefully and specifically names, dates, incidents, connections. The forged deed, the conflicting records, Rusk's presence at her homestead, the contaminated trough, the cut fences, the cattle, the pattern. She signed it with her full name. She sealed it and set it on the kitchen table and would ask Thatcher in the morning to take it when he rode to the county seat. She went to bed. She didn't sleep easily, but she slept, and she had not always been able to say that in the past weeks. Outside, the Wyoming night was cool and dry and full of stars, And somewhere in town, Gideon Rusk finished his drink and thought about the widow, who hadn't disappeared the way widows were supposed to, and began to think about what came next. He was still thinking when the lights went out in the saloon. And in the house at Boone Ranch, 9 children slept in beds they had begun, slowly and without quite meaning to think of as their own. Thatcher rode to the county seat on a Monday, alone, over Miriam's quiet objection that she should go with him. "You're more useful here," he said, which was true and also not the whole truth. And she knew it and didn't press it, because she had 9 children and a ranch to manage, and because sending him alone meant she didn't have to sit in the wagon for 3 hours each way thinking about things she had not yet decided what to do with. He came back Tuesday evening with 2 things. The first was a reply from the marshal's office, not the marshal himself, but a deputy named Crane who had written with the careful, hedged language of a man who had received the letter, read it, understood its implications, and was not yet certain which way the wind was going to blow politically before committing himself to a direction. The letter acknowledged the complaints. It noted that Silas Crowder was a well-established figure in the territory with significant legal standing. It said the matters would be reviewed. It said nothing else. Thatcher set it on the kitchen table without comment. Miriam read it twice and set it back down. "And the general delivery," she said. He pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. It had been opened. Not by Thatcher, the seal was old, the fold worn from being handled, as if someone else had read it before it found its way to the general delivery box. She registered this and said nothing and opened it. Daniel's brother, Edmund Holloway, Nebraska. The letter was dated 4 months earlier, which meant it had traveled a complicated route before arriving here, and the fact that it had been opened and resealed was something she put carefully aside to examine later. Edmund had written with the blunt, spare sentences of a man who did not use extra words. He said he had received her earlier letter. He said he was sorry about Daniel. He said he had something she needed to know. Daniel had sent him copies. Not of everything, not the full deed documentation, but the original filing certificate from the Territorial Land Office, the one filed when they first settled 9 years ago, the one that predated Crowder's fraudulent paperwork by 7 years. Daniel had sent it to Edmund with a note saying, "Keep this somewhere safe, you never know," which Edmund had done, and which Edmund now wanted her to know was available if she needed it. Edmund said he could bring it or send it, whichever she told him. Miriam read the letter a second time. Then she set it on the table and pressed both palms flat against the wood and breathed. "Good news," Thatcher said. He wasn't asking. "My original deed filing," she said. "Daniel sent a copy to his brother years ago. Edmund has it." Thatcher was quiet for a moment. "That predates Crowder's paperwork. By 7 years." He leaned back against the counter. "That changes things." "Yes," she said, "but the letter was opened." He looked at the envelope, before it got to the delivery box. "Someone read it," she said. "Someone knows Edmund has the document. Someone knows I know." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, she could hear Thomas and Levi doing something in the yard that involved running and biscuit. Normal sounds. The sounds of a house that had a life in it. "I need to write to Edmund tonight," she said. "And he needs to move the document somewhere safer than wherever he currently has it. And he should not reply to this address." Where should he reply to? She thought. "Beaumont," she said. "The hardware store." He said he knew Daniel. "He hasn't given me a reason not to trust him." "I'll ask him tomorrow," Thatcher said, "whether he's willing." She nodded and picked up the letter. "Thatcher," she said. It was the first time she'd used his given name without the Mr. attached. She hadn't planned it. It came out the way things come out when you've been careful for a long time and a small part of your guard comes down without asking permission. He noticed. She could tell he noticed, because something brief and careful moved across his face and then was managed. "Thank you," she said, "for going." "You needed me to go," he said. That was reason enough. She went to write the letter. The weather that had been threatening arrived on Wednesday. Not a catastrophic storm, Wyoming in late summer was not prone to catastrophe, more prone to the grinding persistence of heat and dry that broke eventually into something violent enough to remember and then returned to heat. What came Wednesday was a hard, driving rain that lasted 2 days and turned the yard to mud and flooded the low section of the south pasture where the ground didn't drain properly and collapsed a section of the older barn roof that Thatcher had been meaning to address and had not gotten to. Everyone worked. There was no division between ranch work and housework. During those 2 days, it was simply work. All of them doing whatever needed doing wherever it needed doing. Aaron and Thatcher and Pete on the barn roof with what materials they had. Will redirecting drainage channels with a shovel, while Thomas handed him things and kept a running commentary that Will ignored with the patience of an older brother, Clara and Nora, managing the house against the wet that came under the doors. Miriam moving between all of them, assessing, directing, doing. Elsie kept the younger children and Biscuit out of the way, which was a full-time operation. On the second evening of the rain, Thatcher came in from the barn soaked to his collar and sat at the kitchen table with the particular exhaustion of a man who has been working hard in cold, wet conditions since dawn. Miriam set coffee in front of him without being asked. He wrapped both hands around the cup and didn't say anything for a while. The children were already asleep, early, exhausted, the kind of sleep that comes from real physical work. The house was quiet except for the rain on the roof, and June's small breathing from the corner cot where Miriam had moved her during the storm to keep her warmer. "The east section of the barn roof is worse than I thought," Thatcher said. "I saw," Miriam said. She was drying her hair with a towel, standing near the stove for the warmth of it. "How bad?" "Bad enough that it needs to come down and be rebuilt rather than patched. That's a week's work minimum, and I don't have the timber on hand." He set down the cup. "I'm going to have to ride to the mill at Carver's Crossing. That's 2 days round trip." "I know. I'll manage here," she said. He looked at her. "I know you will." A pause. "That's not what I'm worried about." "What are you worried about?" He turned the cup in his hands. "If Rusk knows as I'm away, he probably knows before you leave," she said. "That's how it works." "Yes, Pete stays here," she said. "Aaron is as useful as Pete in a confrontation and more useful in most other ways. Will can manage the stock work. We have the rifle. Can you use it? Daniel taught me years ago. I haven't used it in a while. I'm not a marksman. Close range, it doesn't matter," he said. "You don't need to be accurate. You need to be willing." "I'm willing," she said without hesitation. He looked at her for a moment. "I believe you." "You should," she said. "I've been willing since February. I've just been choosing a different approach when possible." He almost smiled. Not quite. Thatcher Boone's smiles were rare enough that she'd started cataloging them. The slight loosening around his mouth, the small shift of something behind his eyes. It was close to a smile. "I'll go Friday," he said. "Back Sunday." "We'll be fine," she said. He nodded and stood up and took his cup to the sink, and she registered the particular domestic naturalness of the motion a man washing his own cup in his own kitchen at the end of a hard day, and then registered that she'd registered it, and turned back to the stove. "Miriam." "Yes." "The letter you wrote to Cheyenne," he said. "The magistrate's office. I had it sent from the county seat, not from here. Less traceable." She turned to look at him. "When did you?" "When I was there Monday," he said. "You'd left it on the table. I assumed you wanted it sent." She had left it there for him. She hadn't said so explicitly, because she hadn't wanted to ask explicitly, and he had simply understood and done it without requiring her to ask. She did not know what to do with that. She had been managing her own life and her children's lives by herself for months, making decisions, asking for help when she had to, but never expecting it to simply appear. "Thank you," she said, for what felt like the 100th time. "Stop thanking me," he said, not unkindly. "Why? Because you keep saying it like you're surprised," he said. "And you shouldn't be surprised." He went upstairs. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and listened to his boots on the stairs and the floor above, and then the quiet of his room, and then just the rain. She should not be surprised. She turned that over in her mind for a while, standing by the warm stove. Then she went to check on June and went to bed. Thatcher left Friday morning before the children were up. He went quietly, which she appreciated, because 6-year-old Levi had developed an attachment to departure ceremonies that added 20 minutes to any leave-taking, and usually involved a question about when the person was coming back that escalated into a negotiation. She heard his horse from her window. She did not go down. The day was ordinary in the particular way that days are ordinary when you're aware of what they're covering the effort to be normal as a kind of armor. The children worked. Will handled the stock rotation with the calm authority of a boy who had grown 2 inches in confidence since arriving at Boone Ranch, and Miriam noticed this and said nothing, because some things were better witnessed than commented on. Clara had found a way to dry herbs on the porch that produced better results than the kitchen method, and was evangelical about this. Thomas had developed an unlikely interest in the account ledgers after seeing Miriam work with them, and she'd started showing him how to tally supply records, which he did with intense concentration and occasional catastrophic errors that they corrected together. Saturday passed. Saturday night, Miriam didn't sleep well. Not because of anything that happened. Nothing happened. Pete did a fence line check at dusk and found nothing concerning. The cattle were settled. The yard was quiet. Biscuit slept at the foot of Levi's bed and did not bark, which was either reassuring or indicated the dog was not the watchdog Levi believed him to be. She lay awake anyway, listening, the way you listen when you know a threat exists, even if you can't pinpoint its timing. Sunday morning she was in the kitchen early, June on her hip, working on breakfast, when Levi came down the stairs at a run that had the specific character of alarmed speed rather than ordinary morning speed. "Mama," he said, "the creek." She was already moving. The creek that ran along the northeast boundary of Boone Ranch property was not large 3 feet across as in dry weather, 8 or 10 after rain. The rain 2 days ago had pushed it to the far edge of its banks, the current running fast and brown, carrying sticks and debris, and the particular smell of moved earth. Levi had been at the creek. He'd been at the creek because 6-year-old boys go to creeks the way water goes downhill, regardless of instruction, and she knew this, and had told him not to, and was not surprised, and was not the point. The point was that Levi had been at the creek, and Aaron was at the creek, and Pete was at the creek, and they were all at the creek looking at the water, with the kind of stillness that preceded bad news. Then she heard a sound she'd almost missed under the rush of water, a sound that resolved as she got closer into a voice, thin and frightened. I can't get." She saw him then. Not Levi. Levi was on the bank beside Aaron, white-faced and shaking, pointing. Further down, 30 feet, 40 carried there by the current, one arm hooked over a rock outcropping that was keeping him from being swept further, but not bringing him back. Clinging. Small Caleb. Her 4-year-old had gone to the creek after Levi. Had gotten in, or fallen in, or been pulled in by the bank edge, giving way she would piece together the sequence later, not now. Now he was in fast current 30 feet downstream, with his grip on that rock beginning to fail because his arms were small and the water was not. She was running before she'd consciously decided to run. Pete reached the bank edge first and went in, which was the right decision, and almost the wrong outcome. The current was stronger than it looked from the bank, running in the specific way of post-rain creek water that was deceptive, smooth on the surface and pulling hard below. Pete got 6 feet out before the current pushed him sideways, and he had to fight to keep from being carried himself. Aaron had the rope from somewhere. She would never find out how he'd gotten to the barn and back so fast. She would just accept that he had, and was already tying it. Miriam reached the bank. She assessed in the 2 seconds she had to assess. Pete was struggling. The rope was Aaron's best option, but required someone to throw it accurately to a 4-year-old, whose arms were occupied with holding on to a rock. And the rock itself was the problem, because Caleb's grip on it was the only thing keeping him in place, and any attempt to throw something to him risked startling him into letting go. She took the other end of the rope from Aaron, tie it to that post. Now. He moved. She went in. The cold of it hit her like a wall. The rain-swollen water was cold enough to take her breath, which she had not expected and had to account for in the first 2 steps. The current grabbed at her immediately, working at the horizontal rather than the downward, trying to walk her sideways the way it had walked Pete. She had the rope in one hand and she used it, working hand over hand against the current, rather than trying to walk through it, keeping her feet on the creek bed when she could feel it and swimming the short sections where she couldn't. She reached Caleb in less time than it felt. He was rigid with cold and fear, his arms locked around the rock, his face a white pinched thing that she would see in her sleep for a long time. One word, barely sound. "I have you," she said. "Let go of the rock on my count. Hold on to me. Do you understand?" He nodded. His teeth were chattering. 3, 2, 1. He let go of the rock and grabbed her, arms around her neck with the desperate strength of a child who is terrified, and the current took them both for a moment, the rope going taut and nearly pulling her arm from its socket. And then it held, and Pete was in the water beside her from the other direction, and Aaron and Will were pulling from the bank. They got Caleb out first. Nora had blankets, she'd thought of it herself, had run to the house and come back with blankets, and Caleb went into them immediately, shaking so hard she could feel it from 3 feet away. Clara was there with him, wrapping him, speaking to him steadily. Miriam was climbing the bank herself, rope still in her hands, when she registered the sound different from the water, different from the children, a sharp crack that could have been wood in the current, but wasn't. Pete heard it too. He turned toward the northeast fence line. 2 men, on horseback outside the fence watching, not riding, not approaching, watching the creek incident with the flat pieces of men who had arrived to do something, and were now recalculating whether the current situation provided the cover they needed or complicated their plans. Miriam stood on the bank in creek water to her knees and looked at them. One of them she didn't recognize. The other she did. Not Rusk, a different man, but she'd seen him twice, in Rusk's company, the sort of secondary figure who appeared at the edge of events. She looked at them. She held the rope. After a moment, the unrecognized man said something to the other man that she couldn't hear. And then they turned their horses and rode away. She watched until they were out of sight. "Mama," Aaron said beside her. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "Get Caleb to the house. Get him warm. He needs warm water if you can heat it, and dry clothes." "What about I'll be right behind you," she said. "Go." She stood on the bank one more moment. Her hands were shaking. She noticed this with the clinical distance of a woman who had learned to observe her own physical responses without letting them govern her decisions. The shaking was cold and adrenaline, and the specific, bone-deep relief of a child recovered from danger, and it was entirely appropriate and would pass in a few minutes. She went to the house. Caleb was installed by the stove within 10 minutes, dry and wrapped and drinking warm water with honey, because Nora had thought of the honey. He was still shaking, but not the rigid, locked shaking of a child in hypothermic danger. He was the ordinary, cold shaking, the coming-back shaking. "You went to the creek," Miriam said. He looked at her with enormous eyes. "You know you weren't supposed to go to the creek." "Levi went," he said. "Levi is 6, you are 4. Did Levi going make it safe?" A pause. "No," he admitted. "No," she agreed. "Are you going to go to the creek without a grown-up again?" "No." "Tell me why." "Because the water is fast and it doesn't care how old I am," Caleb said, in the specific tone of a child reciting something he'd been told before, and now believed with rather more conviction than previously. "That's right," Miriam said. She wrapped her arms around him carefully, the way you hold something you almost lost, and held on for a moment. He patted her arm. 4 years old, wet-haired, wrapped in blankets, comforting her. She let him. Thatcher came back Sunday afternoon. He read the yard before he dismounted. She watched him do it from the kitchen window, the way he sat his horse for a moment and looked at the people in the yard and the state of them, reading. His gaze went to Caleb, who was on the porch in the sun being monitored by Clara and Elsie both. Then to Aaron, whose face still had the tightness of someone who'd had a bad morning. Then to Miriam in the window. He dismounted and came inside. She told him what had happened. All of it, Caleb. The creek, the rope, the men at the fence line. She told it plainly and in order without dramatizing it, because it was dramatic enough on its own merits. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he went out to the barn, and she heard him in there for a while, moving things, and she didn't go after him, because she understood that a man sometimes needed a few minutes with something physical to work through what he was feeling. He came back in after 15 minutes. "The men at the fence line," he said. "They left when they saw what was happening. They recalculated," Miriam said. "Pulling children out of a creek doesn't provide the kind of chaos they were hoping to find. They were going to do something," he said. "Probably. While I was gone. That was probably the point," she said. "Thatcher. They had a plan and the creek disrupted it. The plan still exists." He looked at her steadily. "I know. And we can't sit here and absorb indefinitely," she said. "We've written letters. We've documented incidents. The marshal's deputy sent a non-committal reply. The territorial magistrate hasn't replied at all. Crowder still has his lawyers and his connections and his land official, and we have a copy of a document in Nebraska that hasn't arrived yet." "I know all of that," he said. Then what do we do? She said. I'm not asking because I don't have thoughts. I'm asking because you know this territory and these people better than I do, and I want to think through it together. He sat down at the kitchen table. She sat across from him. This was new, not the sitting. They sat across from each other at meals every day. This was the deliberate sitting, the facing each other with the specific intention of working something through together. The ranch business, the accounts, the practical discussions, those had happened at this table before. But this was different in a way she felt and acknowledged and set aside. Crowder's strength is legal, he said. Every move he makes looks legitimate from a distance. The forged deeds look like real deeds. The land official makes it official. The intimidation, the fence cutting, the trough, the men, none of it is directly traceable to him. It's all deniable. So documentation alone isn't enough, she said. Not unless we have documentation that directly links him to the crimes rather than just the pattern. Edmund's document links him to fraud, she said. If the original filing predates his deed and his deed was registered fraudulently. We need someone with authority to investigate the land official, Thatcher said. Not the marshal. Someone above the marshal. Federal, maybe. Or a territorial magistrate who isn't already connected to Crowder, Miriam said. Beaumont mentioned that Macy approves filings. Macy is the land official. If we can demonstrate a pattern of fraudulent approvals, my families, the 3 other families Beaumont mentioned. We need those families, Thatcher said. Their testimony. Their documentation. She'd been thinking the same thing. They're afraid, she said. I understand why. Crowder is the reason they're afraid. People who are afraid can still testify, he said. If they believe there's a real chance of it succeeding. If they don't believe, they're walking into something that will retaliate against them and fail. Which means we need to give them a reason to believe it can succeed before we ask them to take the risk, she said. Yes. She looked at the table. That's the problem. We need their testimony to build the case, but we need the case to be credible before they'll give testimony. Edmund's document breaks that circle, he said. If it's as solid as he says, an original territorial filing, predating Crowder's deed by 7 years, filed by Daniel Holloway in good faith that is independently verifiable fraud, that doesn't require anyone else's testimony to establish. It established it itself. If we can get it here safely, she said. I'll ride to meet Edmund, Thatcher said. She looked at him. If the letter was opened before it reached general delivery, they may already be watching Edmund, he said. He's in Nebraska. If I ride to meet him somewhere between here and there, we control the handoff. That's a week, she said, at least. Maybe less if I push the pace. She thought about a week with Rusk's men watching the property and no Thatcher at the ranch. She thought about Caleb at the creek and the 2 men at the fence line and the way they'd looked at her from their horses, calculating. Send a telegram first, she said. Tell Edmund to come to a specific point and wait. Don't say why. If they're monitoring his mail, they can't monitor telegrams the same way, he said. Or not as easily. Do it tomorrow, she said, and don't go alone. Pete can come. Take Aaron, she said. He looked at her. Aaron is 14, she said. He is already more capable than Pete in situations that require judgment. Pete is useful here. He knows the stock. He knows the land. Aaron is, she stopped. Aaron needs to be doing something real. He's been carrying the weight of what happened to his father and feeling useless about it for months. Give him something real. Thatcher was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. Aaron. She nodded. Miriam. He looked at her directly. While I'm gone. If they come, I know, she said. I mean it. If Rusk himself comes, don't try to manage it alone. I have the rifle and I know how to use it, she said. That's not what I mean. He leaned forward slightly, the particular intensity of a man making sure he was being understood. I mean that if Russ comes with enough men to make a confrontation dangerous, you take the children and you go to Peterson. He said his wife wanted your help with the livestock medicine. Use that. He won't turn you away. She hadn't thought about the Petersons as a retreat option. She registered this that she'd been thinking only in terms of defense, of holding the ground, and he was think also in terms of tactical withdrawal. Okay, she said. Promise me, he said. She looked at him. A man who had come back with a wagon. A man who had held Caleb on the seat and worked the pump so a sick child could drink. A man who had not reconsidered arrangements I've made. I promise, she said. He nodded once and pushed back from the table. She thought he would leave then, but he didn't. He sat there for a moment, and she had the impression that he was working up to something, which was unusual. Thatcher Boone was not a man who had to work up to things he wanted to say. Caleb was in the water a while before anyone realized, he said. Less than 5 minutes, she said. By the time I got there, he'd been in perhaps 3. You went in after him. There wasn't anyone else to go, she said. Pete was in. Pete was struggling, she said. The current was stronger than it looked. He was looking at her with the expression she hadn't named yet, the one that appeared occasionally at dinner or in the evening when he thought she wasn't watching him, and that she had decided to continue not naming, because naming it would require her to decide what to do with it. You could have told Aaron to use the rope, he said. You didn't have to go in yourself. Aaron's good, she said. He isn't his mother. I threw that rope further than he would have. Thatcher almost smiled again. Almost. You're not wrong, he said. I know, she said. He left the kitchen. She sat at the table for a moment after, alone, and allowed herself 30 seconds of something she couldn't quite categorize. It was not peace exactly, and not certainty, and not comfort in any uncomplicated sense. It was the feeling of a problem being addressed by 2 people who were thinking about it together, rather than one person carrying it alone. And that feeling had a specific weight that she hadn't felt in so long that it was almost unfamiliar. She got up and started on dinner. The telegram went Monday. Edmund replied Tuesday, 1 line, understood, 3 days. Wednesday was quiet. Thursday morning was quiet, in the way that Miriam had learned to distrust the particular stillness before weather. The attack on Thursday afternoon came on 2 fronts simultaneously. The first was the fire. Small, not the barn, not the house. The haystack in the northeast corner of the property, the one furthest from the well and closest to the dry grass at the fence line. Will saw the smoke first from the east pasture and came at a dead run, shouting before he'd covered half the distance. Miriam was already assessing the situation when she heard him. Wind direction, distance from the barn, the dry state of the grass beyond the fence line that could carry a fire from the haystack into the pasture if the wind held. The well's distance and the speed they could run a bucket line against a fire that was already 12 feet high. She made decisions in the space of a breath. Nora, take the little ones to the east pasture, far side now. Clara, go with her. Thomas, you're on the bucket line with me. Will, Pete, she looked. Where was Pete? Pete. Pete came out of the barn at a run. Bucket line, she said. Now, the fire was not catastrophic. This was the thing she understood about it. Even in the middle of fighting it, it had been set specifically where it would require their full attention and resources, where it would pull everyone toward the northeast corner, where it would create noise and smoke and urgency. It was a distraction. She realized this on the 3rd bucket, running back toward the well. She turned. The second front was at the house. 2 men she didn't recognize had come in from the west while the fire pulled everyone east, and they were at the house now, on the porch, one of them trying the door and the other standing with the casual alertness of a lookout. Not Rusk. Not his direct men she hadn't seen before, men hired specifically for today. June was in the house. Elsie was in the house, because Miriam had told Nora to take the little ones, but Elsie had gone back inside for something 5 minutes earlier, and Miriam hadn't tracked her exit. Miriam dropped the bucket. She ran. She hit the porch steps at speed, and the man at the door turned in time to put himself between her and it, but not in time to grab her, and she shoved past with the specific physics of a woman who was not stopping, and he hadn't expected that. She got the door open and got inside. Elsie was in the corner of the kitchen with June in her arms. 7 years old, standing in the corner with her baby sister held against her chest, and her face was Miriam would carry that face for the rest of her life. Not crying, not screaming, just still with June against her waiting. Go, Miriam said. She pointed at the back door. Out the back and run toward the east pasture. Nora is there. Go, Mama Elsie now. Elsie went. The man from the porch was behind her in the kitchen doorway. The lookout was still outside. She heard his boots on the porch boards. She assessed the kitchen in 2 seconds. The rifle was in the corner by the back door. 3 steps. She would have to turn her back on the man in the doorway to reach it. She turned her back. She reached it. She turned back with the rifle leveled before he'd covered half the distance to her. He stopped. They looked at each other. He was somewhere in his 30s, weathered, The face of a man who had done this kind of work before and understood the mathematics of a rifle pointed at him by a woman who had not flinched when she picked it up. "Get out of my house," Miriam said. He assessed her for a moment, looking for the hesitation, the tremor, the thing that would tell him she wouldn't. He didn't find it. She wouldn't. He took a step back, then another. He was back on the porch when she heard the horse, a single horse, coming fast from the east, and she knew that gait before she saw the rider. Aaron, 14 years old, coming in at a full run on a horse he'd ridden out of the pasture bareback, which she had not known he could do, but apparently he could. And he came around the house and pulled up short enough that the horse threw its head and danced, and he looked at the two men on the porch and at his mother in the doorway with the rifle. "Mama," he said. His voice was steady, 14 years old, bareback on a dancing horse, voice steady. "I have it," she said. "Go back to the fire. They need you on the bucket line." He looked at the men. "Aaron," she said, "the fire." He held the men with his eyes for another moment. This look that was his father's look, she realized, the exact set of it, the particular quality of a man deciding whether he needs to do something, and then he turned the horse and went back. The two men left. She didn't fire. She could have. She'd had the shot when they crossed the yard going back toward the fence line, but she held it. Because shooting unarmed retreating men was not what she was going to become, and because it would be used against her, and because she had made a decision in February about the kind of person she was going to be in this fight, and she intended to keep it. The fire was out by the time she got back to it. The bucket line had worked barely, imperfectly. Everyone soaked and blackened and exhausted. Will with a burn on his right forearm from a coal that had jumped, Pete with a gash on his leg from the ground he couldn't see through smoke. The haystack was gone, but the barn and the pasture were intact. She treated Will's burn and Pete's gash and told them both they'd done well, and meant it. Then she gathered her children, all 9 of them, in the yard. She looked at them dirty, scared. Caleb still pale from Sunday, Elsie with June still clutched against her, Thomas shaking slightly with adrenaline, Levi with his hand on Biscuit for comfort. "I need you to tell me you're all right," she said. They told her, one by one, all 9, all right. She nodded. "Good," she said. "You were good today." Aaron looked at her. She looked back at him. "You were good," she said again, specifically to him. He looked away at the horizon, the way boys look away when something matters too much to acknowledge directly. She let him. She sent them inside and stood in the yard alone, with the afternoon light going orange and the smell of burned hay in the air, and thought about what had happened and what it meant and where it was going. They were escalating. The fire, the men at the house, they'd crossed a line they hadn't crossed before. They'd come onto the property while Thatcher was away. They'd come to the house. It would get worse before it got better. She had known this from the beginning, but knowing it abstractly, and standing in her yard smelling smoke, while her children went inside to a house where 2 men had stood on the porch an hour ago, those were different things. She would tell Thatcher when he got back with Edmund. She would tell him everything, clearly, and without dramatizing it, and then they would figure out what came next. She went inside to her children. Above the ranch, the Wyoming sky went red with evening, the way it did some nights, coming down hard and close, and the light it threw across the yard was the color of something that had been through fire and come out different. Not softer, different. Thatcher came back Friday evening with Aaron and a man Miriam didn't know. Edmund Holloway was 51 years old, shorter than Daniel had been, with the same careful eyes and the same economy of movement she'd noticed in her late husband, that particular Holloway quality of not wasting motion or words. He looked at Miriam from the wagon seat for a moment before he climbed down, and she could see him doing what people did when they'd heard a great deal about someone and were now measuring the reality against the account. Whatever he'd expected, she seemed to satisfy it. He came forward and took her hand. "Miriam," he said, "I should have come sooner." "You came now," she said. "That's what matters." He nodded once, the way Daniel used to nod, and she felt the specific grief of resemblance the way a gesture from someone living can suddenly illuminate someone gone. Thatcher climbed down on the other side, and she looked at him over the wagon's back, and he looked at her, and something passed between them in that look that she would not have been able to transcribe, but that contained, in some compressed form, the full accounting of what had happened while he was gone. The fire, the men at the house, Elsie in the corner with June the rifle. He had seen the haystack. The burned ground where it had been was visible from the track coming in, and she'd watched his face as the wagon came through the gate, and he'd registered it. He said nothing about it immediately. She understood this he was processing, and he would come to her when he was ready, and she would tell him then. Edmund needs dinner, she said, and so do you, and so does Aaron. Aaron had climbed down from the wagon with the particular quality of a boy who had been somewhere and done something, and come back different in a way he hadn't yet found words for. She pulled him close for a moment, briefly, and felt him accept it before he stepped back. I'm fine, Mama, he said. I know, she said. Go wash up. Edmund Holloway ate with the children around the big table, and said little but watched everything with those careful eyes, and she could see him cataloging the household, the ordered chaos of 9 children. Thatcher at the head of the table answering Levi's question about what Nebraska looked like. Clara passing the bread without being asked. Caleb inserting himself into the conversation with 4-year-old non-sequiturs that no one ignored. Edmund watched all of this with an expression she could not quite read. After the children were in bed, he set the document on the kitchen table. It was a single folded sheet inside an oilcloth wrapper, inside a leather pouch, protected with the specific care of something that had been understood to matter. Miriam opened the wrapper carefully, the oilcloth stiff from years of storage, and unfolded the document on the table. The original territorial filing certificate for the Holloway homestead, dated May 14, 1878. Daniel's handwriting on the declaration form, his signature at the bottom. The Territorial Land Office stamp, faded but legible. The official registration number in the top right corner. She looked at it for a long moment. He had it filed in duplicate, Edmund said, from across the table. Kept one copy himself, sent one to me. Said he didn't trust that far from civilization with only one record of anything important. He paused. That was Daniel. Yes, Miriam said softly. That was Daniel. Thatcher was looking at the document. The registration number, he said. That's cross-referenceable in the territorial records. If Crowder's deed was filed under a different number claiming the same parcel. The conflict is provable, Miriam said, without anyone's testimony. The numbers either match the parcel description or they don't. They don't, Edmund said. I had a lawyer look at it in Nebraska. He said whoever filed Crowder's deed either created a fraudulent number or altered an existing one. Either way, it requires someone in the land office to have approved it knowingly. Macy, Thatcher said. Almost certainly, Edmund said. But proving Macy was involved, rather than just negligent, that's the harder piece. They sat with this for a moment. The pattern, Miriam said. The 3 other families Beaumont mentioned. If their deeds were processed through Macy's office with the same irregularities, the same kind of conflicting registration numbers, that's not negligence. That's a pattern of deliberate fraud. You'd need those families' documents, Thatcher said. Or you'd need someone with the authority to subpoena the land office records, Edmund said. Someone who could pull the original filings directly and compare them. Miriam looked at the territorial filing certificate. 9 years of her life, her husband's life, her children's first home condensed to a single sheet of paper in a leather pouch that had traveled from Wyoming to Nebraska and back. There's a territorial magistrate, she said. I wrote to his office in Cheyenne. I haven't received a reply. You wrote to the magistrate's general office, Edmund said. There's a difference between the general office and a specific magistrate. She looked at him. What do you mean? Crowder's connections go to the county level, Edmund said. They may extend to the general magistrate's staff. But there's a man in Cheyenne named Horace Bellamy. I heard his name from the lawyer in Nebraska. He said Bellamy has been quietly investigating homestead irregularities for the past 2 years. He's not a public figure. He operates carefully. Thatcher was looking at Edmund with the focused attention of a man pulling a thread. You heard this from a lawyer in Nebraska. The lawyer has connections in territorial governance, Edmund said. He was careful about it. Said Bellamy specifically is the kind of man who doesn't want cases brought to him. He comes to the cases when he's ready. But he also said if someone had the right kind of evidence documented, specific, provable, and the right kind of timing. What's the right kind of timing? Miriam asked. Edmund looked at the document on the table. Bellamy has apparently been building towards something for a while. The lawyer suggested he may be close to moving. If a case came to him with independent documentary, evidence, and witnesses, people who could testify to their own losses, he'd have the foundation he needs to act officially. Miriam sat back. Thatcher looked at her. "We're the foundation," she said. "You're the starting point," Edmund corrected, not unkindly. "The other families are the pattern." She thought about the Petersons, who had wanted her livestock medicine knowledge. She thought about Beaumont's carefully measured words about quiet enemies. She thought about the families whose names Beaumont had mentioned and hadn't mentioned, the ones who had been in this territory longer than she had, who had lost things and absorbed the loss and tried to move forward, and were still, quietly, in proximity to their losses. "I have to talk to them," she said, "the other families." "Miriam," Thatcher said. "Not tonight," she said, "but soon. Before we contact Bellamy, if we go to him with only my document and my account, we're one widow with a claim. If we go to him with 4 families, documented losses, a pattern." "That's different," Edmund said. "That's a case," she said. The kitchen was quiet. Edmund looked at Thatcher with a question in his expression that wasn't a question exactly, more an assessment the same look, Miriam suspected, that Daniel would have given a man in this position. The older brother measuring the situation his sister-in-law had landed in. Thatcher met it steadily. Whatever Edmund was measuring, he seemed to reach a conclusion. He nodded once, the Holloway nod, and looked back at his coffee. She would find out later what was said between them when she went to check on the children that night, and they were alone in the kitchen. Edmund told her eventually that he'd said to Thatcher, "You know she's going to keep going, regardless of what any of us think." Thatcher had said, "I know." Edmund had said, "And you're all right with that." Thatcher had looked at him for a moment and then said, "I'm more than all right with it," which Edmund had found, he said, to be a satisfactory answer. She told him she wished he'd told her the satisfactory answer at the time. He said he was telling her now. Thatcher sat with her on the porch after Edmund went to bed, and she told him about Thursday. All of it. The fire, the calculations she'd made, the men at the house, Elsie in the corner. She told it plainly, the same way she'd told him about Caleb and the creek, because plain was the way she knew how to tell hard things anymore. He listened without moving. When she finished, he was very quiet for a long time. "You held them with the rifle," he said. "Yes, alone. Will and Pete were on the fire. The children were in the east pasture. There wasn't anyone else. He was looking at the dark yard. She couldn't see his face clearly in the porch light, just the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, which were not relaxed. "I should have been here," he said. "You needed to meet Edmund," she said. "I should have been here." She let that sit without arguing it, because there was no version of this where he was wrong he should have been here, and also he'd needed to go, and both things were true, and one of them didn't cancel the. "Nothing happened," she said. "The children are safe." "This time," he said. She didn't answer that because they both knew what this time meant. He turned to look at her. "I can't keep watching this from the outside. We're reacting every incident. We're reacting. They set the terms and we respond." "I know," she said. "Edmund's document and Bellamy, that's the real move," he said. "Everything else has been defense. But contacting Bellamy, building the case, getting the other families to testify, that takes time we may not have." "I know," she said again. "So we need to do something that changes the calculation on their end," he said. "Something that makes the continued harassment cost more than stopping it." She thought about this. "What did you have in mind?" she said. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I've been thinking about this on the ride home. Crowder's operation depends on the target being isolated. Every family he's taken land from was alone, no community support, no connections, no one willing to stand alongside them publicly. The harassment works because it makes the target more isolated as it goes on. People distance themselves so they don't become targets. That's been happening here," she said. "The neighbors, the town. But not completely," he said. "Beaumont, Peterson's wife. Even Drummond, he was worried about property values, which means he's worried about his property, which means he doesn't want Crowder's operation expanding either. He just hasn't done the math yet." She saw where he was going. "You want to make the coalition visible," she said, "publicly, so Crowder can't pick us off one at a time. If he knows there are 5 or 6 families who are documented and connected and willing to be seen as connected, it changes what attacking any one of us costs him," he said. "Right now, harassing us is low cost. We're contained." If we're not contained, the coalition has to be real, she said. Not symbolic. People who will actually stand up at a hearing, actually sign their names to documents, actually be present and on record. If we build it and it collapses under pressure, we're worse off than before. Yes, he agreed. That's the risk. I'll ride to the Peterson place tomorrow, she said. That's the natural start. She already reached out, even if indirectly. From there, Beaumont can help me reach the others. He was looking at her with that expression again. What? She said. Nothing, he said. You went from defensive to operational very quickly. I've been waiting to go operational for months, she said. Defense was what was available. Now we have something to work with. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I need to talk to you about something else. The shift in his voice was subtle, but she caught it. All right, she said. He looked at the yard for a moment, the way he sometimes did when he was constructing something carefully. Crowder's next move isn't going to be harassment, he said. It's going to be legal. The harassment was softening, making us look unstable, creating incidents, building a picture of disorder around this property. His lawyer is going to use that picture. To do what? She said. To challenge your status here, he said, specifically yours. The children's. He paused. You're a widow with 9 children living on another man's property under an informal work arrangement. That's a vulnerable position, legally. If his lawyer files some kind of petition claiming the arrangement is irregular, claiming the children are in an unstable situation. She felt something cold move through her. He could try to separate them, she said. He could try, Thatcher said. I don't know how far it would get. But it would take time to fight, and during that time, you'd be dealing with officials and hearings, rather than building your case. And it would create exactly the kind of public picture Crowder's been building toward. She understood what he was telling her. She'd understood it before he finished saying it. She was already sitting with the shape of it, the way you sit with something that has arrived in your life and requires you to decide what you're going to do. You have a solution in mind, she said. I have a proposal, he said carefully, which you can refuse, and refusing it won't change anything between us or this arrangement. She waited. He turned to look at her directly. Marry me. The yard was very quiet. Not because he said, and stopped and started again. I'm not asking because I want something from you. I'm asking because if we're married, the children are legally mine. Crowder can't challenge their status. You can't be characterized as a transient household. And you'd have full legal standing in any property dispute, or hearing not as a dependent on my goodwill, as a co-owner. She looked at him. Separate rooms, he said, same as now. Independent. I'd put your name on the deed. I've already talked to the lawyer in Carver's Crossing about what that would require. Your wages become your own property. I would expect nothing from you beyond what you're already giving this ranch. She sat with this. And nothing changes unless you decide otherwise, he said. This isn't a condition. It's a protection. Legal protection that I can offer and that Crowder can't work around. She looked at the yard and thought about Elsie in the corner of the kitchen with June pressed against her chest. She thought about the men at the porch, the rifle, the calculation she'd had to make alone. She thought about 9 children who had started to believe that Boone Ranch was home, who called the place by its name without qualification, who had stopped saying when we leave. She thought about Thatcher's name on a marriage certificate beside hers, and what it would mean, and what it would cost, and what it would provide. She also thought about what it wasn't. It wasn't what she'd had with Daniel, which had been a specific thing built over years of a specific life. It wasn't uncomplicated. It wasn't without risk. It was a man sitting on a porch in the dark, telling her he would put her name on a deed and expect nothing and call it a protection. Why, she said. He looked at her. Not the legal reasoning, she said. I understand the legal reasoning. Why do you want to do this? What is this to you? He was quiet for a moment. Because you deserve to fight from solid ground, he said. Not from contingency. Not from... He stopped. You've been fighting from the edge of things since February. From borrowed time and borrowed shelter, and the constant awareness that any of it could be taken. I don't want that to be your position anymore. I want you to stand on ground that's yours and fight from there. She looked at him for a long time. That's not a selfish reason, she said. No, he agreed. It would be easier if it were, she said. I know how to handle selfish reasons. Something moved across his face. I know you do. She looked back at the yard. I'll think about it, she said. Give me 2 days, all right. And I have conditions, she said. Tell me. Elsie gets to know the reason, she said. Not a version of it. The actual reason. She's 7 years old, and she's the one who's been watching you most carefully since we got here. If I ask this of her of all of them, it needs to be honest. Agreed, he said. Aaron too, she said. Aaron is 14, and he is effectively the man of this family, and he deserves to know what's being decided and why. Yes, he said. And the deed, she said, not just the promise of it. The actual deed, with my name on it, before the wedding. He looked at her. So that you're not giving me legal standing in exchange for a signature, she said. So that it's established independently. So there's no question about the sequence or what was contingent on what. He held her gaze. I'll ride to the lawyer Monday, he said. She nodded. Then I'll give you my answer Wednesday. She went inside. She did not sleep easily, which she had expected. She lay in the narrow room off the kitchen, with June warm against her, and went through it methodically. The way she went through the account ledgers, looking for the places where the numbers didn't balance, looking for what she might be missing, looking for the things she hadn't considered that would change the calculation. She found, after considerable effort, that the numbers balanced. She talked to Aaron Tuesday morning. She found him at the east fence with Will, and she told Will to take a water break, and she stood at the fence line with her 14-year-old son and told him plainly what was being considered and why. Aaron listened. He was very still in the way he went still when something mattered. When she finished, he said, Is it what you want? She'd expected, Is it safe? Is it smart? Is it legally sound? She had not expected, Is it what you want? She looked at her son. I think it might be, she said carefully. Eventually. Right now it's what we need. But those aren't always different things. Aaron thought about this. He's good to us, he said. Finally. The way a boy says something he's been holding. Yes, she said, he is. He's good to you, Aaron said. Differently. She said nothing. Papa would have liked him, Aaron said, which was the most complicated sentence she'd heard in months. Not because of, I don't mean it like that. I mean, Papa liked men who did what they said. Who didn't fuss about it. Yes, she said softly. He did. Aaron looked at the fence line. You should say yes, he said. That's my opinion. She held the back of his neck briefly, the way she'd done when he was small. He let her. Thank you, she said. Go back to work. Elsie was harder. Not because she objected, she didn't object. She was harder because she was 7 years old, and she understood more than 7-year-olds were supposed to understand. And talking to her about it meant looking directly at that understanding. Miriam sat with her on the porch steps Wednesday morning and told her the truth. The legal situation. Crowder's threat. What the marriage would mean and what it would not mean. Elsie listened with her knees pulled to her chest. When Miriam finished, Elsie said, He already loves us. Yes, Miriam said. I think he does. He's not doing it for love, Elsie said. Not accusatory observational. Working it out. He's doing it to protect us, Miriam said. Love and protection aren't always the same thing, but they're not always different things either. Elsie thought about this with the focused seriousness of a child processing a complex concept. Are you going to love him? She said. Someday? Miriam looked at her daughter. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Elsie seemed to accept this. That's okay, she said. Papa took a while to love the mare too. But he did eventually. Miriam looked at the porch boards and managed her face carefully for a moment. That's a reasonable comparison, she said. Elsie leaned against her. Say yes, Mama. Wednesday evening she found Thatcher in the barn. He was working on a piece of harness that needed mending, the kind of task a man does with his hands when he's waiting for something and needs to occupy them. He heard her come in and turned. She looked at him across the barn. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face changed not dramatically, not the way it would change in a story designed to dramatize the moment. Just a settling. The particular quiet of a man who has been carrying something uncertain and has just set it down. All right, he said. Not romantic, she said. I need you to know that I understand what this is and what it isn't. I'm not confused about it. I know, he said. And I'm not trading myself for security, she said. I want that to be clear. I've thought about it, and I believe you when you say the terms are independent. This is a practical decision I'm making clearly. I know that too, he said. She looked at him. I also want you to know that I don't take it lightly. What you're offering, the fact of it. He held her gaze. Neither do I, he said. She nodded once and left the barn. The lawyer came Thursday, not to Carver's Crossing, but to the ranch itself. Thatcher had ridden for him, and he arrived in a buckboard with his papers. A small, neat man named Calloway, who took the situation in with professional efficiency and asked exactly the right questions and no extra ones. The deed amendment was drawn up, witnessed by Edmund and Agnes, signed by Thatcher, and registered with Calloway's office seal. Miriam's name, Miriam Holloway, her name, not a future married name, was added to the deed as co-owner before any other papers were signed. Calloway looked at her when it was done. "This is unusual," he said. "Most things worth doing are," she said. He had the grace to smile. The wedding was Friday morning. No ceremony. Calloway had the authority. The papers were signed and witnessed by Edmund, Agnes, Pete, and all 9 children. Levi asked 3 separate times if this meant Thatcher was his father now, and Thatcher crouched down in front of him and said, "It means I'm responsible for you," which is most of the important parts. Levi considered this. "Biscuit too?" "Yes, Levi. Biscuit too." Levi appeared satisfied. Elsie cried, which surprised everyone, including Elsie. "I'm not sad," she said, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I don't know why I'm crying." "Sometimes things that are good make you cry too," Clara told her, with the authority of a 10-year-old who has made her peace with complexity. Edmund shook Thatcher's hand. His grip was long, and the look between them was the kind that men exchange when words would be either too much or not enough. Miriam signed her name on the certificate, Miriam Holloway Boone. She looked at it for a moment. She did not cry. She was not a crier, generally. But something happened in her chest, a shift, a settling, a thing that had been braced for a long time coming down off its bracing. Agnes made cake. She had not mentioned cake, had not announced cake, had simply made it and produced it after the signing and set it on the table without comment, because Agnes communicated affection through food rather than words, and had apparently decided this was an occasion that merited communication. The children ate cake at 10 in the morning. Nobody mentioned that it was 10 in the morning. That afternoon, while the children were in the yard and Edmund was resting, and Agnes had gone home, Miriam sat down with Thatcher at the kitchen table, with the ledgers and the map, and began planning. Not the ranch work, they had systems for the ranch work. This was different. This was the operational planning, the thing Thatcher had called going on a fence the night before. Edmund's document. Bellamy and Cheyenne, the other families. The coalition. She had spent Tuesday riding to the Peterson place, as she'd planned, and Margaret Peterson had met her on the porch before she dismounted, and what followed had been an hour of conversation that Miriam had not fully anticipated. Margaret Peterson was not a quiet woman. She had been quiet about Crowder because her husband was cautious and she had deferred to his caution, but the caution had been costing her something she wasn't willing to pay indefinitely. She'd listened to Miriam lay out the situation and the evidence and the plan, and when Miriam finished, she'd said, "My husband needs to hear this tonight. Can you come back tomorrow?" Miriam had come back Thursday. Robert Peterson was a methodical man, and he had questions, and she answered them, and he had more questions, and she answered those too. He wanted to see Edmund's document, which she had brought, and he'd examined it with the focus of a man who understands land records. His own filings showed the same class of irregularities, the conflicting registration notation, the timing of Macy's approval, the specific language that appeared in Crowder's deeds and shouldn't have appeared in a legitimate filing. He'd sat with this for a while. Then he'd said, "Who else are you talking to?" Beaumont had given her 2 names. Both families had lost land within the last 4 years. One of them, a man named Garrett, who had sold out cheaply under implied threat rather than outright force, was harder to reach. He'd retreated into a kind of bitter quiet that Miriam recognized as the state you arrived at when you'd spent a long time feeling defeated and had started to believe it was permanent. She'd gone to him anyway, on Thursday afternoon, and spent 45 minutes on his porch in the afternoon heat talking about what she had and what she needed and what she was asking of him. And he'd said nothing for a long time and then said, "If it fails, we're all worse off. If we don't try, we're guaranteed to stay where we are," she'd said. He'd looked at his property, what was left of it, the reduced acreage he'd kept, the house that needed work he couldn't afford, the fields that could be more than they were, if he had the resources back that Crowder's pressure had drained from him. "Let me talk to my wife," he'd said. She'd told him she'd come back. The second family, the Delacourts, had lost a claim on water rights rather than land directly, which was different but connected, and which Beaumont had explained was another vector Crowder used when he couldn't take the land outright. Madeline Delacourt, whose husband had died of a fever the previous winter, had met Miriam at her door with the wariness of a woman who had been approached by people claiming to want to help and had been disappointed consistently. Miriam hadn't tried to sell her on it. She just told her what she had and what she was building and what she needed, and had said, "You don't have to decide now. Think about it. The offer doesn't go away." Madeline Delacourt had said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Are you afraid?" "Every day," Miriam said. The woman had looked at her for a long moment. "I'll think about it," she'd said. "Come back Monday." Now, sitting with Thatcher over the map, Miriam laid all of this out. He listened in the way he always listened, complete attention, no interruption. "So Peterson is essentially committed," he said. "Garrett is possible. Delacourt is unknown. Peterson is committed if Bellamy is real," she said. "He's a practical man. He wants to know there's an actual mechanism of accountability before he puts himself on record." "Then Bellamy is the first step," Thatcher said, "not the coalition. We need to know Bellamy exists and is willing before we ask anyone else to commit." "Edmund gave us a name in Cheyenne who can reach him," she said. "I'll ride to Cheyenne," Thatcher said. "We'll ride to Cheyenne," she said. He looked at her. "We're co-owners," she said. "It's our case. I'm not sending you as my representative. I'm going with you." He held her gaze for a moment. "The children Edmund stays," she said. "He's been here a week, and he's already got Levi managing him completely. And Agnes can come every day for a week instead of twice." Thatcher looked at the map. 3 days, he said. "There and back." 3 days, she agreed. He nodded. She looked at the document on the table, the original filing, 9 years old, carrying the weight of everything that had happened since. Daniel's handwriting on the declaration, careful and precise. He would have done the same thing, she said, not entirely to Thatcher. Filed copies. Gone to find the magistrate. Built the case. He had good instincts, Thatcher said. "Yes," she said. He did. She folded the document back into its oilcloth wrap. They rode to Cheyenne on Monday, Thatcher and Miriam, Edmund staying with the children, Pete on watch, with instructions from Aaron that were more thorough than any instructions Pete had generated himself. Miriam had gone to Peterson Sunday evening and told him the plan, and he'd given her a letter of documentation to carry signed, dated, specific about the land record irregularities on his filing. She had not heard back from Garrett yet. She had not gone back to Delacourt. She would, but one thing at a time. The ride to Cheyenne was long, and through country that opened up into something vast and indifferent, the kind of landscape that made you understand viscerally why people either loved Wyoming or couldn't endure it. She and Thatcher rode largely in silence, the companionable kind, the kind that had developed between them over weeks of working alongside each other and had matured into something that didn't require filling. Halfway there, she said, "What was her name?" He looked at her. "Your wife," she said. "You mentioned you lost her. You've never said her name." He was quiet for a moment. "Catherine," he said. "What was she like?" He thought about it the way she'd thought about Daniel, honestly, without predifying. "Brave," he said. "She was braver than I was, most of the time. She would have done what you did with that rifle, without hesitating. She wouldn't have told me about it afterward in the same calm voice you used." He paused. She was direct. Didn't have much patience for people who complicated things that didn't need to be complicated. "Did she want children?" Miriam asked. The question had edges she was aware of. "Very much," he said simply. It didn't go the way we hoped." "I'm sorry," she said. "I know," he said. They rode. "Does it?" She stopped, chose her words. "Does it bother you? Having them there?" 9 of them. He looked at her with an expression she was finally beginning to be able to read. "No," he said. "It's the opposite of bothering me." She looked at the road ahead. "Good," she said. Cheyenne was larger than she'd expected and smaller than she needed, the territorial capital, carrying the weight of governance in its buildings and the limitations of it in its streets. They found the name Edmund had given them a clerk at the assessor's office. A small, careful woman named Holt, who processed their arrival with the neutral efficiency of someone who receives unusual visitors regularly and has learned not to signal her reactions. She looked at Edmund's document. She looked at Peterson's letter. She looked at Miriam. "I'll send a message," she said. "Come back tomorrow morning." They came back tomorrow morning. Horace Bellamy was 63 years old, which surprised Miriam. She'd expected someone younger, someone who had not yet been incorporated into the territorial structure. Instead, he was a man who had been in the structure long enough to understand exactly where its weaknesses were and who had spent 2 years carefully mapping them. He met them in a room in the assessor's building, not his official chambers, which Miriam understood to mean he was being careful about the meeting's visibility. He looked at Edmund's document for a long time. He looked at Peterson's letter. He looked at Miriam. "How many families?" he said. "3 currently who can document losses connected to the same official," she said. "Potentially 4. Possibly more that we haven't reached yet." The official's name. "Macy," she said. Something moved in Bellamy's face. Controlled, but she caught it. "I know that name," he said. "I thought you might," she said. He set the documents on the table and looked at them for a moment. "Mrs. Boone," he said, "I've been building something for 2 years." Carefully, without enough to act on officially, he paused. "What you've brought me is the first piece of documented evidence I've seen that is both specific enough to trace and independent enough that it can't be attributed to a personal grudge." "I have a personal grudge," she said. "That doesn't make the document less real." He looked at her. "No," he said, "it doesn't." He sat back. "I'm going to need time. I'm going to need to examine these documents officially, cross-reference the registration numbers, pull the original filings from the land office, and that last part has to be done carefully, because if Macy knows we're looking, evidence disappears." "How long?" Thatcher said. 3 weeks, Bellamy said. "Maybe 4. I need you to do 2 things in that time." "Tell me," Miriam said. "First, get me the other families. Signed statements, documentation of their losses, as specific as possible. The pattern is what gives me jurisdiction." "And the second thing," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Stay alive," he said. "Crowder is going to know something is happening. Maybe not yet, but he'll feel the shift. And when he does, his response will be faster and harder than what you've experienced so far." She held his gaze. "I understand," she said. "I'm not sure you do," he said. Not unkind. Just honest. I've watched this man operate for 2 years. He's patient until he isn't. Once he decides the situation requires it, he removes problems. "He tried to remove me in February," she said. "I'm still here." Bellamy looked at her for another moment. "So you are," he said. The ride back was quieter than the ride out. She rode beside Thatcher through the last hour of daylight and into the early dark, the stars coming out over Wyoming, the way they did out here, sudden, thick, without ceremony. She thought about 3 weeks. She thought about Garrett and Delacourt. She thought about Crowder, knowing something was happening, and what that would look like. He said, "Stay alive," like it was a practical instruction, she said. "It is," Thatcher said. She looked at the dark road ahead. "We're going to need to be smarter about the ranch's vulnerability while this is happening." The fire was a distraction tactic. Next time, it might not be a distraction. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "Peterson, if he's committed, his property adjoins ours on the northeast. If we coordinate watch schedules, 2 ranches watching instead of 1, she said. "And Drummond," he said. "He doesn't like Crowder either. He's been afraid to say so. If we give him a reason to believe this is going to work." "We're building something," she said. "Yes," he said. She rode for a while. "Thatcher," she said, "yes. What you said on the porch," she said, "about wanting me to stand on solid ground." He was quiet. "I'm standing on it," she said. "I want you to know that I feel that." He didn't say anything for a moment. "Good," he said. They rode the last miles in the dark, toward the ranch where 9 children were asleep in beds they had started to call their own, toward the house that had been empty for 7 years and wasn't anymore, toward the work that wasn't finished but had, for the first time, a clear direction and something underneath it that felt, cautiously and without guarantee, like ground that would hold. Bellamy moved in 4 weeks, not 3. The extra week was Miriam's doing. She had gone back to Garrett twice and to Delacourt 3 times, and both had signed. Garrett had sat at his kitchen table with the pen in his hand for a long moment before he put it to paper, and she had not hurried him, because she understood what it cost a man who had been defeated to believe again that trying was worth the risk. Delacourt had cried when she signed, which she'd apologized for, and Miriam had told her not to apologize, that crying was a perfectly reasonable response to being asked to be brave. In the end, Bellamy had 4 families, 4 sets of documents, 4 independent accounts of the same pattern of fraud, running through Macy's office like a thread through cloth. He'd pulled the original land office filings quietly, through a federal channel Crowder hadn't thought to monitor, and the registration numbers told the story without anyone needing to editorialize. The numbers simply didn't match what they were supposed to match. They had never matched. Someone had made them not match on purpose, and that someone had a name and a desk and a territorial salary. Macy was arrested on a Tuesday. Crowder's lawyer tried to contain it. He filed 3 separate motions in 2 days, each one a different shape of the same argument that the evidence was improperly obtained, that the families had conspired, that Bellamy had exceeded his jurisdiction. Bellamy had expected all 3 and had prepared for all 3 with the patience of a man who had spent 2 years making sure his foundation was sound before he built anything on top of it. The motions failed. Warrants for Silas Crowder were issued on a Thursday morning. Gideon Russ learned about the warrants before Crowder did, which was the kind of thing that happened when a man had built his career on knowing which way things were going. He rode to Red Willow that afternoon, and Miriam saw him from the porch. As he came down the main street, she was there with Thatcher, both of them in town for the hearing testimony that Bellamy had requested, and she watched Rusk's face when he saw her standing on the boardwalk outside Bellamy's temporary office. He pulled his horse up. She looked at him. He had managed her husband. He had stood at the edge of a field and watched. He had ridden onto Thatcher's property with that particular smile of a man who expects the world to bend to his employer's will because it always has before. He had sent men to her house while her children were inside. He had calculated each time that she was the kind of problem that would eventually go away if pressured correctly. She had not gone away. Rusk looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Thatcher beside her. Then at the door of Bellamy's office. Then back at her. He said nothing. He turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, and she watched him go, and she felt not triumph exactly. Triumph was too clean for what she felt. It was something more complicated than triumph. It was the feeling of a thing finally, imperfectly, resolving after so long of holding it together by force of will alone that you had almost forgotten what resolution felt like. "He's going to run," Thatcher said beside her. "Let him run," she said. "Bellamy has his name." Bellamy did have his name. Rusk was found 3 days later in a boarding house in Laramie and brought back to face his own set of warrants, not just for the intimidation and the fence cutting and the trough, which were difficult to prove directly, but for his presence on the day Daniel was killed, which 2 witnesses had come forward to confirm once Crowder's protection collapsed and the calculation about what it cost to stay silent changed. The witnesses were men who had worked adjacent to Crowder's operation and had seen enough and said nothing for long enough that they'd been carrying the weight of it, and when the structure came down, they put the weight down. Miriam testified at the hearing in Cheyenne. She had thought about this moment many times in the months since February, what she would say, how she would hold herself, whether she would be able to do it without her voice breaking. She had imagined it as a confrontation, as something requiring armor. What it actually required was simply accuracy. She told what happened in order, what she had seen and known and documented. She told it plainly, the way she told hard things, and the plain telling was more devastating than anything theatrical would have been because it did not require her to persuade anyone of anything. The documents persuaded. Her account simply confirmed what the documents already said. Crowder's lawyer tried to rattle her twice during questioning. Both times she looked at him steadily and waited for him to finish and answered precisely what was asked. Peterson testified. Garrett testified, his voice unsteady at first and then finding its footing. Delacourt testified with her hands flat on the table in front of her, the way you hold yourself still when stillness is the only armor you have left. When it was over, Bellamy recommended full prosecution. Crowder and Rusk were convicted 7 weeks after the hearing. Macy received a separate conviction. 11 fraudulent land seizures were overturned. 3 county officials connected to the scheme were removed from their positions. The deed for the Holloway homestead was restored to Miriam Boone, née Holloway, legal co-owner of Boone Ranch, On a cold October afternoon, when the Wyoming sky had gone the particular gray of a place settling into winter, she held the deed in her hands and looked at it, her children's first home. The land Daniel had worked for 9 years, that she had worked alongside him, that she had raised the first 7 of their children on, that she had left in February with a wagon and almost nothing, and the specific knowledge that the road ahead had no guarantee attached to it. It was hers again. She sat with that for a while. Then she asked Thatcher to ride with her to the Garrett place, and then to the Peterson place, and then to see Madeleine Delacourt. And at each stop she asked a question she had already decided the answer to, but wanted to say out loud, with witnesses. The question was, who did they know who had lost land under Crowder and had nowhere to go and needed a temporary place to land, while they figured out what came next? She sold the recovered homestead property 6 weeks later. Not to Crowder's successor, not to a land company, not to anyone who would do with it what had been done to her. She sold it to a young couple with 2 children who had been trying to establish a claim in the territory for 3 years and kept hitting walls that she now understood had been constructed by design. She sold it at a price that reflected the land's actual value, rather than the distressed price she would have gotten if she'd sold it in February. And she took the proceeds and sat down with Thatcher and the account ledgers and a map of the North Pasture. They expanded the water access first, the thing that every frontier family needed, and that Crowder had used as a weapon. Then they reinforced the barn that had needed rebuilding since the storm. Then they built 2 additional rooms onto the east side of the house. Not for the children who were already housed, for whoever came next. Because people came. Word traveled the way. Word traveled in the territory not through newspapers or official channels, but through the specific network of people who knew what it meant to be on a broken road with no options. And Boone Ranch had become a place on that network. Families who were stranded, women traveling alone. A man with 2 boys who'd lost his wife and his homestead claim in the same bad season and had nowhere to take his children. Miriam fed them, found them work, or pointed them toward it, gave them what she knew about livestock medicine and account keeping and how to document a land claim properly so it couldn't be easily challenged. She did not perform charity, she offered tools, which was different. She had learned the difference from Thatcher, who had offered her tools when she had needed them without dressing it up as something else. The sign above the gate had been iron letters for decades, Boone. One morning, she came out to find Thatcher and Aaron and Will standing beside the gate with a length of new iron. They had been working on it for a week without telling her, Aaron with the focus of a boy who has found something worth making carefully. Below Boone, in smaller letters, no family too large. She stood at the gate and looked at it. Thatcher came to stand beside her. Aaron's idea, he said. I know, she said. He gets the direct ones from his father. She felt Thatcher look at her, the particular attention of a man registering something. The months between the wedding and October had done something to them that neither had planned and neither had entirely resisted. It had happened the way things happen in a life, lived closely alongside someone, not in grand moments, though there had been some of those, but in the accumulation of ordinary ones. The evenings on the porch. The mornings when he poured her coffee before she asked, and she handed him the account ledger open to the right page, without explaining why. The times he'd ridden toward her children in moments of danger, with a speed and intention that was not obligation. The night she'd been awake with June and he'd appeared in the kitchen doorway without being called, because he heard it and hadn't wanted her to handle it alone. At some point she had stopped being surprised by him. She had not expected this part. She had made a practical decision clearly, and without sentimentality. And somewhere in the months of fighting alongside someone who did not flinch, who did not recalculate his commitment when the cost rose, who held Caleb on a wagon seat, and held a rifle on a porch, and held quietly and without announcement the general shape of her family together, somewhere in all of that, what she'd told Elsie might be possible eventually had become what it was. She had not announced it. She hadn't needed to. The children saw it. Edmund had seen it during the hearing. Thatcher's hand had found hers briefly in the hallway outside the testimony room, and Edmund had said nothing, which was how she knew he approved. Agnes had said once, in the kitchen, without preamble, "You look different than you did in July." "How so?" Miriam had asked. "Like you stopped waiting for the other shoe," Agnes said, and went back to the stove. She thought about that now, standing at the gate. She had spent so much of her life the part before Daniel, the part during, and the long, terrible part after braced for the other shoe. The thing that would come and take what she had. She had been so practiced at the bracing that she had almost mistaken it for who she was, the woman standing ready to absorb the next blow, the woman whose instinct was to hold on rather than to open. She had not stopped being that woman entirely. She was not sure she would ever stop being that woman entirely, and she wasn't sure she'd want to. That readiness had kept her children alive and fed and together through things that should have broken them. But she had learned that readiness and openness were not opposites. You could be ready for what might come and still let in what was here. Elsie came through the gate and stopped beside her, looking up at the new sign. No family too large, she read. Then that's about us, isn't it, originally? Originally, Miriam said. But now it's about everyone, Elsie said. Yes, Elsie looked at Thatcher. Was it your idea or Aaron's? Aaron's, Thatcher said. Elsie considered. He's getting smarter. Don't tell him that, Aaron said, from the other side of the gate, where he'd been listening. He's already insufferable. I can hear you, Will said, from somewhere near the barn. The afternoon dissolved into the ordinary noise of a working ranch with too many people and not enough quiet, and Miriam stood at her gate with her name on the deed in her pocket and her children in the yard and the man who had come back with a wagon beside her. She thought about what she wanted to say to someone who might be standing where she had stood on a broken road, in the heat of a bad summer, with too many children and nowhere to go, and the specific loneliness of a situation that seems to have no solution because every door has shown you its back. She would say, the math that other people do about you is not the only math. She would say, the people who count your children as a burden are counting wrong. She would say, it is not weakness to need help, and it is not charity to accept it from someone who offers it, honestly, and the difference between those two things is worth knowing. She would say, the home they tell you that you can never have is sometimes already being built by someone who just hasn't met you yet. And she would say, the fact that it takes longer than it should, and hurts more than it should, and costs more than it should, that is not evidence that it was not worth doing. It is evidence that it was. She took Thatcher's hand. Not because she needed to, not for anyone watching. Just because she wanted to, and she had learned that wanting something good was not a thing to be careful about. He didn't say anything. He held on. Above the gate, the iron letters caught the last of the afternoon light, and the yard filled with the sound of 9 children and 1 mud-colored dog, conducting the ordinary business of a life that had been, against considerable odds, made.